before written history, before empires rose and fell. Civilizations left behind structures, symbols, and artifacts that modern science still cannot fully explain. Massive stones moved without machinery, astronomical alignments precise to the decimal, maps drawn of coastlines no human eye had ever seen, or should have seen. Were these the work of forgotten genius, or something we've yet to understand? The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. These aren't myths. These aren't legends. These are hard physical realities carved into the ancient world, waiting. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Deep in the southern tip of India, in the ancient city of Thiruvananthapuram, stands a temple that has outlasted dynasties, colonial empires, and centuries of human ambition. The Padmanabhaswamy Temple, dedicated to the reclining form of Lord Vishnu, is one of the wealthiest and most sacred sites on earth. Its towers rise in the Dravidian style, ornate and deliberate, as if carved not just from stone, but from devotion itself. Pilgrims have walked these corridors for over 1,000 years. But beneath the temple floors, hidden in a series of underground chambers, lies something that has quietly unsettled historians, archaeologists, and spiritual authorities alike. In 2011, a Supreme Court-ordered inventory of the temple's underground vaults revealed a staggering collection of gold, jewels, and ancient artifacts, statues encrusted with precious stones, golden thrones, and ceremonial objects whose combined estimated value exceeded $20 billion. It was called one of the greatest treasure discoveries in recorded history. Vaults A through E yielded their secrets, one by one, to the court-appointed committee. Then they reached Vault B. Unlike the others, Vault B sits behind a door unlike anything else in the complex. There are no bolts, no hinges visible from the outside, no conventional lock mechanism. Instead, the iron door, massive, ancient, and sealed flush against the stone, bears the carved image of two cobras. Not as decoration, as a warning. According to the temple's traditional authorities and certain Hindu scholars, this vault has not been opened in well over a century, possibly much longer. The last known reference to its interior is vague and disputed. What is agreed upon is this: the door has remained sealed, and those who hold authority over the temple have insisted it must stay that way. The reasons given range from the spiritual to the deeply practical. Temple priests and some scholars argue that Vault B is protected by a Naga Bandham, a powerful serpent charm, a form of ancient ritual sealing believed in tantric tradition to bind a door not through physical mechanism, but through consecrated intention. To open it without the correct ritual reversal, they warn, is to invite misfortune, not symbolically, but in a very real and serious sense, at least within the framework of the tradition that built this place. The Supreme Court Committee, tasked with documentation, ultimately chose not to force it open. Their reasoning was cautious and, to some observers, conspicuously quiet. That silence, more than anything, is what draws the curious mind inward. What could possibly be inside a vault so deliberately sealed that even a legal authority stepped back from it? The rational answer is straightforward enough. More treasure, perhaps the most significant cache of all, preserved behind the one door no one dared open. Some historians believe the wealth accumulated by the Travancore royal dynasty over centuries may have been stored here precisely because of the psychological barrier that cobras and sacred sealing represented. A lock made of belief. But others ask a different kind of question entirely. Some researchers, drawing from oral traditions and fragmented temple records, suggest that Vault B may contain not just gold, but documents, ancient manuscripts perhaps, or cosmological texts of a kind that could reshape what we understand about early Indian civilization. There are those, careful, credentialed, but willing to speculate, who point to the precision of the temple's founding date, its astronomical alignments, and ask whether the builders of this structure were preserving something far older than the temple itself. Something passed down. Something meant to wait. The door, as of today, remains shut. The cobras remain carved into its face, patient as stone, unreadable as ever. And somewhere beyond it, in the dark beneath one of humanity's most sacred places, whatever rests there continues to rest undisturbed, sealed by faith, by law, or perhaps by something we no longer have the language to fully name. What are they protecting? Or more unsettling still, what might they be protecting us from? Some mysteries are sealed behind iron doors and sacred warnings. Others are swallowed whole, buried not beneath stone and ritual, but beneath water and time. And if the depths of a temple vault represent what humanity has chosen to hide, then what lies beneath Lake Fuxian in China's Yunnan province may represent something even more disquieting. What history has simply forgotten. Lake Fuxian is not a well-known name in the Western world, but it should be. Sitting at an elevation of roughly 1,720 meters above sea level in the mountainous interior of Yunnan, it is one of the deepest freshwater lakes in China, in some points plunging to over 150 meters. Its waters are extraordinarily clear, fed by underground springs, and for centuries it was regarded by local communities as sacred, mysterious, and not entirely of this world. Ancient texts from the region describe it with reverence, as a place where the boundary between the living and something older felt unusually thin. For most of modern history, those descriptions were treated as poetry. Then, in 1992, a local fisherman reported something strange beneath the surface. Not a creature, not a trick of light. Structures, geometric, deliberate, and unmistakably made by human hands. What followed was one of the most intriguing and frustratingly incomplete underwater investigations in modern archaeology. Subsequent diving expeditions and sonar surveys in the years that followed confirmed what the fishermen had seen. Beneath the clear, cold waters of Lake Fuxian, spread across a substantial area of the lakebed, lie the remnants of what appears to be a sizable settlement. Roads, platforms, walls, and building foundations arranged with a coherence that rules out natural geological formation. Stones are cut, angles are deliberate. Whatever this was, someone built it. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is, who and when? Chinese archaeologists who have studied the site note that the structures share some stylistic characteristics with ancient Dian Kingdom architecture, a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that flourished in Yunnan from roughly the 7th century BC until its absorption into the Han Dynasty around 109 BC. The Dian people were, by any historical measure, remarkable. They produced intricate bronze work, maintained complex social hierarchies, and built on a scale that still surprises researchers who encounter their remains. It is not impossible, scholars suggest, that a Dian settlement of considerable size once occupied land that is now permanently underwater. But that explanation, tidy as it sounds, carries its own complications. For the structures to now sit beneath Lake Fuxian at the depths where they've been found, the lake level would need to have risen significantly, dramatically even, at some point in the past. The geological and hydrological record of the region does support the possibility of major water level changes over long periods, but the specific timeline required to account for the submersion of a functioning settlement is not straightforward. Some estimates, depending on which structures are referenced and at what depth, push the potential age of occupation into territory that predates the Dian Kingdom by centuries, or more. This is where the investigation begins to open outward. A small number of researchers, not fringe voices, but individuals with academic credentials and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable data, have pointed to certain features of the Lake Fuxian structures that seem inconsistent with what we know of Bronze Age construction in the region. The scale of some of the platforms in particular has drawn attention. If the sonar readings are accurate, certain sections of the underwater complex span dimensions that would have required organized labor at a level typically associated with far more developed state societies than anything previously documented in Yunnan at that period. There are those who look at this and ask a quiet but significant question. Is it possible that the civilization responsible for these structures was not the Dian Kingdom, but something that came before it? Something that the Dian themselves may have only dimly remembered or mythologized? Local oral traditions among communities surrounding the lake speak of an ancient city that descended into the water, not through slow geological change, but through a single catastrophic event. A punishment, some versions say. A consequence. The details vary, as oral histories always do across generations, but the consistency of the central image is notable. A city, a disappearance, and water closing over what once stood in open air. Archaeologists are, rightly, cautious about drawing direct lines between myth and physical evidence. Stories of sunken cities exist in cultures across the world, and most of them reflect psychological and spiritual truths rather than literal geological records. But occasionally, and this is what makes underwater archaeology so persistently fascinating, the story and the sonar image point in the same direction. Further complicating the picture is the relative lack of comprehensive investigation. Lake Fuxian's depth, its remote location, and the logistical challenges of underwater excavation in a protected freshwater environment have meant that full systematic archaeological work has never been completed. What we have are partial surveys, selective diving footage, and reports that raise more questions than they answer. The site has not received the international archaeological attention it arguably deserves, and in that gap between discovery and understanding, speculation, reasonable and otherwise, has naturally filled the space. What is certain is this: something is down there. Something organized, something constructed, something that required planning and purpose to build. It rests now in cold, clear water, untouched by the surface world, indifferent to the debates happening above it. A sealed vault asks you to imagine what's inside. A submerged city asks something harder. It asks you to imagine the lives that once moved through it, the meals prepared, the roads walked, the ceremonies held in buildings that now collect silt in silence. Who were they? How long did they live there before the water came? And what do we lose as a civilization every time a chapter of human history sinks beyond the reach of the record? The lake holds its answer, as it always has. Still, patient, undisturbed. Water swallows cities whole, and still we search the depths for answers. But sometimes, the mysteries don't sink beneath us. They burrow. Sometimes what a civilization most wanted to protect, to preserve, or to obscure, it placed not under water, but under stone. Deep underground, where darkness is absolute and the weight of the earth above presses down like a held breath. In the highlands of Peru, roughly 250 kilometers north of Lima, at an elevation of over 3,000 meters in the Andean Mountains, there is a place that has been asking questions for longer than most civilizations have existed: Chavin de Huantar. A name that may be unfamiliar to many, but which represents one of the most sophisticated and genuinely puzzling religious complexes ever constructed in the ancient Americas. From the surface, the site presents itself with a certain austere grandeur. Stone platforms, carved monoliths, sunken plazas, the architectural vocabulary of a culture that clearly understood power, ceremony, and the relationship between built space and human psychology. The Chavin civilization flourished here from roughly 900 BC to around 200 BC, at its peak drawing pilgrims and worshippers from across a vast region of what is now Peru. This was not a local shrine. This was a center, a place people traveled to from great distances, driven by something that archaeology has only partially been able to name. But what makes Chavin de Huantar genuinely extraordinary is not what you can see from the surface. It is what runs beneath it. Extending through the interior of the temple complex is a network of subterranean tunnels, narrow, precisely constructed, and far more elaborate than anything required for simple structural or drainage purposes. Archaeologists have mapped dozens of these passageways, which wind and intersect in patterns that seem deliberately disorienting. Ceilings in many sections are low, forcing anyone moving through them to hunch, to slow down, to become physically dependent on whatever light they carried. The tunnels connect chambers of varying sizes, some of which appear to have served specific ceremonial functions. And at the heart of this underground network, in a cruciform chamber at the intersection of several passageways, stands what many consider the most important artifact the Chavin people left behind: the Lanzon, a 4-meter-tall granite monolith carved into a form that is part human, part feline, part serpent, a figure that seems to embody the deliberate merging of the natural world's most potent forces. It was not placed at the entrance, not elevated in an open plaza for all to see. It was placed underground, in the dark, at the literal center of a labyrinth. To reach it, you had to earn it. Stanford archaeologist John Rick, who has led extensive research at the site, describes the tunnel complex as a sophisticated technology of religious experience, a designed environment intended to disorient, to isolate the senses, and to produce in the visitor a state of profound psychological vulnerability. The acoustics of the tunnels, Rick's team discovered, are extraordinary. Sound behaves strangely in these passageways. Voices seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Footsteps echo in ways that feel wrong, misaligned with physical reality. To someone moving through this space without prior knowledge of its architecture, the experience would have been, in the most literal sense, disorienting to the point of the supernatural. Researchers have also found evidence of psychoactive plant use at the site. Carved imagery depicting the San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, appears repeatedly in the decorative stonework. The combination of a deliberately confusing underground space, extraordinary acoustic manipulation, total darkness, and potentially chemically altered perception begins to suggest something more calculated than simple religious ceremony. This was, some researchers argue, a controlled transformation of consciousness, an ancient technology for producing specific mental and spiritual states in those who passed through it, and that most scholars broadly agree upon. But there are layers beneath even that explanation. The tunnel network at Chavin de Huantar is not fully mapped. Sections remain unexcavated, blocked by collapsed stone or simply untouched by ongoing research. And among those who study the site most closely, there is an acknowledged uncertainty about the full extent of what was built here. Some structural analyses suggest the visible tunnel network may represent only a portion of what was originally constructed, that deeper, older sections may exist beneath the levels that have been reached. There is also the question of the water. The site sits at the confluence of 2 rivers, and hydraulic engineering appears to have been a deliberate and sophisticated element of the original design. The Chavin builders, evidence suggests, were capable of routing water through the tunnel system in ways that would have produced sounds, roaring, rushing, subterranean noise, that to a visitor deep inside the labyrinth would have been impossible to source or explain. The earth itself, it would have seemed, was speaking. Who taught them to do this? How did a culture operating with stone tools and without written language develop this level of understanding of acoustics, hydrology, psychology, and architecture, and deploy all of them simultaneously in a single complex? These are not rhetorical provocations. They are genuine open questions in the academic literature. Some researchers go further, pointing to the astronomical alignments visible in the site's layout and asking whether the tunnel network itself was oriented with celestial precision, whether certain chambers were designed to receive light at specific moments of the year, transforming the underground space into something that blurred the boundary between the heavens above and the earth below. Chavin de Huantar was, at its core, a place designed to make people feel small, not in cruelty, but in purpose, to strip away certainty, familiar sensation, and the comfortable noise of the everyday world, and leave a person alone in the dark with whatever they believed was waiting for them there. Somewhere in those unexcavated passages, in stone corridors that have not felt human presence in over 2,000 years, that darkness is still waiting. What else did they build down there? And what, perhaps, did they leave behind? There are mysteries that hide in darkness, beneath lakes, inside labyrinths, behind sealed doors. And then there are mysteries that surface in the most ordinary of places, in fields, in the foundations of old buildings, in the quiet earth beneath towns that have been continuously inhabited for 1,000 years. These are mysteries that emerge not with drama, but with a trowel and a careful hand. And sometimes, What they reveal is more unsettling than anything a sealed vault or a subterranean tunnel could offer. Because sometimes, the mystery is in the body itself. Across Roman Britain, in the towns, farms, and roadside settlements that form the northwestern edge of one of history's greatest empires, archaeologists have been quietly uncovering a burial practice that doesn't fit. Among the orderly cemeteries and the expected funeral rites of Roman provincial life, a significant number of graves contain individuals who were not buried in the conventional Roman fashion. They were not laid flat, arms at their sides, facing the sky in the posture of dignified rest that Roman funerary tradition prescribed. Instead, they were placed in the ground folded, knees drawn toward the chest, bodies curved inward, compact, almost as if arranged to occupy as little space as possible. These are called flexed burials, and in a Roman context, they are deeply, stubbornly anomalous. To understand why they matter, it helps to understand how seriously the Romans took the business of death. Roman funerary practice was not incidental. It was codified, culturally significant, and tied directly to beliefs about what happened to the soul after the body was interred. The correct performance of burial rites was understood to determine the fate of the deceased in the afterlife. Neglect or deviation was not merely disrespectful. It was dangerous to the dead and potentially to the living left behind. The Romans buried their dead with intention, with ritual, and with a consistency that makes the presence of flexed burials in their cemeteries genuinely difficult to explain away. Sites across England, Dorchester, York, Cirencester, and numerous rural settlements have yielded these anomalous graves. In some cemeteries, flexed burials appear alongside conventional Roman interments, separated by no obvious physical boundary, dating to the same general periods. In others, they cluster in ways that suggest deliberate separation, as if those responsible for the burial understood or wanted to signal that something different was happening here. The mainstream archaeological explanation is, on its surface, reasonable. Flexed burial was a pre-Roman Iron Age practice common among the indigenous Celtic populations of Britain before the Roman conquest. It persisted, the argument goes, as a form of cultural continuity, local populations maintaining the burial customs of their ancestors, even as Roman administrative, architectural, and social influence reshaped almost every other aspect of their lives. In this reading, the flexed burials are evidence of cultural resilience, of identity quietly preserved beneath the surface of a colonized world. It is a compelling interpretation, and for many sites, it likely holds. But it does not fully account for everything the ground has given up. Some flexed burials in Roman Britain show evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries to the skeleton that occurred at or around the time of death. Decapitation, in particular, appears with a frequency that has drawn sustained scholarly attention. Individuals buried with their heads removed, placed between their knees, or positioned at their feet. Bodies buried face down rather than face up. Hands positioned behind the back in ways consistent with binding. These details introduce a category of interpretation that moves well beyond cultural continuity. One prominent line of research suggests that at least some of these unusual burials represent individuals who were regarded, in death, as potentially dangerous. Across many ancient cultures, and this instinct appears with remarkable consistency across societies that had no contact with one another. There existed a fear that certain dead might return, not metaphorically, but in a very literal, physical sense. The practice of decapitation, of binding, of placing the body in a flexed or prone position has been interpreted by some folklorists and osteoarchaeologists as deliberate containment, a method of ensuring that whatever animated this particular person in life could not animate them again in death. This was not, in the ancient world, considered superstition. It was considered prudent. But who were these individuals? What distinguished them in the eyes of those who buried them from their neighbors laid to rest in conventional graves nearby? The skeletal evidence offers some clues and many frustrations. Some show signs of unusual life histories, evidence of disease, of physical difference, of deaths that were sudden or violent. Others appear, by every skeletal measure available, entirely unremarkable. Ordinary people, buried extraordinarily. There are researchers who have begun to examine these burials through the lens of social marginality, asking whether the individuals interred in this fashion were those who existed at the edges of their communities. Foreigners, criminals, the mentally ill, in whatever form ancient communities recognized and categorized that experience. People whose lives had, for reasons now invisible to us, placed them outside the boundaries of normal social belonging. And then there are those who look at the geographic distribution of these burials, clustered near boundaries, near crossroads, near the thresholds of settlements, and note that in Roman and pre-Roman belief alike, liminal spaces were understood to be zones of particular spiritual significance. Places where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it was thinner than elsewhere. Perhaps the placement was not incidental. Perhaps those responsible for these burials were making a statement about exactly where, in the geography of the sacred and the profane, these particular dead belonged. The bodies have been exhumed. The bones have been measured and catalogued and dated. And still, the question that matters most remains open. What did the living fear from these dead? And whatever it was, were they right to fear it? The Romans feared their dead enough to bind them, to fold them, to bury them at crossroads with their heads removed. They built elaborate rituals around the management of death because they understood, in some deep and serious way, that the manner of dying mattered. That what was left unresolved in life did not simply dissolve when the body went into the ground. And if that instinct tells us anything, it is this: that the most consequential deaths in history are rarely the ones that happen in the open. They are the ones that happen quietly, on a road somewhere, far from witnesses, in the space between one world and another. In the summer of approximately 1323 BC, a young Hittite prince named Zananza set out on a journey that should have changed the ancient world forever. He never completed it, and the question of what happened to him on that road, who ordered it, who carried it out, and why, has occupied historians for nearly a century without resolution. To understand the weight of his death, you have to understand the moment into which he was riding. Egypt, in the late 18th dynasty, was in a state of profound internal fragility. The reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten had upended the religious, political, and social order of the kingdom with a force that left lasting fractures. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, had died unexpectedly. The boy king, no more than 18 or 19 years old, leaving behind no male heir and a throne that suddenly had no clear occupant. Egypt, one of the most powerful and rigidly structured civilizations the ancient world had ever produced, found itself, for a dangerous and disorienting moment, without a king. Into this vacuum stepped a woman whose courage or desperation, depending on how you read the historical record, was extraordinary by any measure. Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun and daughter of Akhenaten, did something that had no precedent in Egyptian history. She wrote a letter. Not to an Egyptian noble, not to a courtier or a general. She wrote to Suppiluliuma I, the king of the Hittites, Egypt's longtime rival, a powerful and expansionist force to the north, and she made him an offer that must have stunned every advisor who read it. She had no husband, she wrote. She would not take one of her own servants as a king. But if Suppiluliuma would send her one of his sons, she would make him pharaoh of Egypt. The letter, which survives in Hittite records and is one of the most remarkable diplomatic documents from the ancient world, carries in its lines something close to desperation. Ankhesenamun repeats herself. She insists she is not lying. She asks, with a directness that feels almost unbearable across 33 centuries, simply not to be abandoned to a fate she cannot control. Suppiluliuma, understandably, was suspicious. An Egyptian queen offering the throne to a Hittite prince was so far outside the normal boundaries of diplomatic reality that his first instinct was to assume a trap. He sent an envoy to Egypt to verify the situation. The envoy returned confirming what the letter had claimed. and so Suppiluliuma made his decision. He selected his son Zananza and sent him south, toward Egypt, toward a throne, toward a marriage that would have united two of the ancient world's greatest powers under a single royal line. Zananza crossed into Egyptian territory and disappeared. The Hittite records, clay tablets recovered from the ancient capital of Hattusa in what is now central Turkey, document Suppiluliuma's response to the news of his son's death with a rawness that is rare in ancient diplomatic correspondence. He was not merely politically outraged, he was grief-stricken and then furious. He accused the Egyptians of killing his son and launched a military campaign in retaliation, a series of raids into Egyptian-controlled territories in the Levant that, in a bitter historical irony, resulted in Hittite soldiers bringing a plague back to Anatolia that would kill thousands, including, eventually, Suppiluliuma himself. Zananza's death, in other words, sent ripples outward that shaped the trajectory of two civilizations for decades. But who killed him? The Hittite records accuse Egypt without specifying the mechanism or the individual responsible. The Egyptian record is, characteristically, silent on the matter. A silence that is itself a kind of evidence. And in that silence, historians have built competing cases that remain unresolved. The most frequently named suspect is an elderly Egyptian official of immense influence who had served under Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and who ultimately claimed the throne of Egypt in the aftermath of Tutankhamun's death. Had both the motive and the proximity. A Hittite prince on the throne of Egypt would have ended any political future for Egyptian-born claimants. Zananza's elimination would have been, from Ai's perspective, not merely convenient, but necessary. The general Horemheb, who would later succeed Ai as pharaoh, is also named in some analyses as a possible architect of the interception. He commanded the military apparatus that would have been required to stop a foreign prince on the road to Memphis, and he had his own reasons to ensure that Egypt's throne remained in Egyptian hands. There are those who go further still, who look at the timing, the precision of the interception, and the subsequent behavior of the Egyptian court, and argue that this was not a reactive political assassination, but a premeditated trap. That Ankhesenamun's letter, however genuine it may have seemed, was sent with the knowledge, or under the influence, of factions within Egypt who intended from the beginning to use it as bait. If that is true, then Ankhesenamun herself becomes a more ambiguous figure. Not merely a desperate widow reaching across a border for help, but possibly a woman trapped between forces she could not resist, writing a letter whose consequences she may not have fully understood. She disappears from the historical record shortly after Zananza's death. No tomb has ever been conclusively identified as hers. No record of her fate survives. A prince dies on a road, a queen vanishes from history, and two empires bleed for years in the aftermath. What truly happened in that space between the Hittite border and the Egyptian court, on that road, in those days, in the silence that history never filled? And did anyone, in the end, answer for it? Some deaths echo through centuries. Zananza's did, reshaping empires, erasing a queen from history, and leaving behind a silence that no diplomatic record has ever adequately filled. But Egypt, more than perhaps any other civilization in the ancient world, understood that silence was not emptiness. Silence, to the Egyptian mind, was a container, a vessel, something you filled deliberately, with meaning, with ritual, with stone. And nowhere is that understanding more present, more physical, and more deeply strange than in the plateau of Giza, a place the world believes it knows, and almost certainly does not. Everyone knows the pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the slightly smaller Pyramid of Khafra, the Sphinx, worn smooth by millennia of wind and the particular indifference of time. These are among the most studied structures on Earth, and yet Giza continues, with a patience that feels almost deliberate, to produce revelations that unsettle the established picture. In the early 1990s, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, then one of the most prominent figures in Egyptian antiquities, led an investigation into a structure that sits in the shadow of the main Giza complex, and which had been known in general terms for decades without ever receiving the focused scholarly attention it warranted. The structure is referred to in various sources as the Osiris Shaft, or the Tomb of Osiris. It sits not on the surface of the plateau, but beneath it. And what Hawass and his team found when they descended into it was a site of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary questions. The shaft descends through 3 distinct levels, cut directly into the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. The first level, closest to the surface, contains several burial niches, unremarkable in the context of Egyptian funerary architecture. The second level is more interesting, containing a larger chamber with a sarcophagus and the bones of what appear to be multiple individuals. Artifacts recovered from this level suggest it was in active use during the late period of ancient Egypt, roughly the first millennium BC, possibly as a genuine burial site, possibly as a ceremonial space, possibly as both. But it is the third level that changes the nature of the conversation entirely. At its deepest point, the shaft opens into a chamber that sits in near total darkness, surrounded on all sides by water. Not groundwater seeping through cracks, but a deliberate architectural feature. A chamber designed to be surrounded by water, its central element a large stone sarcophagus placed on a raised platform in the middle of a flooded room. The sarcophagus is empty. Around it, carved into the stone walls, are figures of the gods, guardians arranged in a specific configuration that, to specialists in Egyptian religious iconography, is immediately recognizable as connected to the mythology of Osiris, the god of the dead, of resurrection, and of the underworld. The symbolism is not subtle. In Egyptian cosmology, Osiris was associated with the primordial waters of creation, with the force that preceded and underlied all existence. A chamber surrounded by water at the base of a deep shaft, containing an empty sarcophagus at its center, is not a random arrangement of architectural elements. It is a deliberate symbolic construction, a representation in stone and water of the moment before resurrection, the moment of waiting. The question that Hawass himself acknowledged, and that has been asked with increasing seriousness since, is a simple one. How old is it? The artifacts recovered from the upper levels provide dating evidence for the periods in which the shaft was used and modified. But the cutting of the shaft itself, the original act of descending into the bedrock and creating this 3-tiered underground complex, is considerably harder to date. Stone cut from bedrock does not carry an inscription. It does not contain organic material suitable for radiocarbon analysis. What it carries is form, proportion, and technique. And when specialists examine the deepest level of the Osiris shaft, the precision of its cutting, the scale of its construction, the specificity of its symbolic program, some of them find themselves hesitant to assign it comfortably to the periods most easily evidenced by the surface artifacts. There are researchers who look at the third level of this shaft and place its original construction significantly earlier than the conventional timeline suggests. Not by decades, but potentially by centuries, or more. This is not a mainstream position, and it is not without serious methodological problems. But it is a position held by individuals who have stood in the chamber, studied its construction, and found themselves unable to reconcile what they see with the accepted chronology. Robert Bauval, whose work on the astronomical alignments of the Giza pyramids brought him both acclaim and controversy, has written about the Osiris shaft in the context of a broader argument that the Giza Plateau contains layers of construction and sacred use that extend further back in time than the conventional record acknowledges. The shaft, in his reading, is one piece of a larger underground symbolic landscape, potentially connected to other subterranean features of the plateau that have not been fully explored or disclosed. This is where documented archaeology and more speculative inquiry begin to share the same corridor. Because the Giza Plateau does have known subterranean features beyond the Osiris shaft. Tunnels, chambers, and passages that have been partially explored, partially sealed, and in some cases actively restricted from independent investigation. The geology of the plateau and the decades of excavation and construction in the area have made comprehensive underground mapping genuinely difficult. But difficult is not the same as impossible, and the fact that a flooded chamber of this symbolic significance sat beneath the most studied archaeological site on Earth for untold centuries without systematic investigation is itself a kind of answer to how much we assume we already know. The water in the lowest chamber still surrounds the platform. The sarcophagus still sits empty at its center. The carved gods still stand at their posts on the walls. Whatever ceremony this space was built to hold, whatever act of symbolic resurrection it was designed to facilitate, it has not been performed in a very long time. Or has it simply not been performed yet? Beneath the Giza Plateau, an empty sarcophagus sits surrounded by still water, waiting in a chamber that may be older than anyone is entirely comfortable admitting. It was built to mean something, designed with precision, with symbolic intention, by people who understood that certain truths are best placed underground, away from the noise of the surface world, in the quiet dark where meaning can accumulate undisturbed. But not every ancient message was hidden. Some were placed in the open, on the face of stone, under the open sky, painted or pressed into rock with a directness that needed no architecture, no shaft, no sealed door. Just a surface, a hand, and the oldest human impulse we know, to mark the world and say simply, "I was here." In the far southwestern corner of Egypt, where the desert becomes something close to absolute, where the Sahara stretches in every direction without relief, without water, without the suggestion of anything living, there is a place called Wadi Sura, the Cave of Swimmers, a sandstone shelter tucked into the rocky landscape of the Gilf Kabir Plateau, made briefly famous by its appearance in the novel and film The English Patient, and known to archaeologists as one of the most significant rock art sites in the entire African continent. The cave takes its popular name from the figures painted on its walls, human forms rendered in ochre and pigment, their limbs extended in postures that the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi, who documented the site in 1933, interpreted as swimming. In a desert that receives almost no rainfall, the image of swimming figures struck him as evidence of a vastly different climate, a time, thousands of years ago, when this part of the Sahara was green, wet, and inhabited. Subsequent climate science has confirmed that this was indeed the case. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BC, the region experienced what researchers call the African humid period, a climatic window during which lakes and rivers existed across what is now barren desert, supporting populations whose lives bore almost no resemblance to anything that survives there today. The swimmers, then, are explained. They are paintings of people in a place that once had water, made by hands that knew what water felt like. But Wadi Sura contains more than swimmers, and it is the other images, specifically a collection of handprints found in a section of the site, that have introduced a layer of genuine mystery into the archaeological picture, one that has not been cleanly resolved. Among the hundreds of painted figures and symbols at the site, researchers documented a series of handprints that are anomalous in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Unlike the human handprints found at rock art sites across the world, which represent one of the most universal and immediately recognizable forms of ancient human expression, these particular prints are strange. Their proportions are wrong. The fingers are unusually long relative to the palm. The overall dimensions do not correspond to adult human hands, nor to children's hands, nor to any configuration of a normal human hand pressed against a flat surface. Researcher Emmanuel Honoré, working with a team that conducted detailed analysis of the Wadi Sura paintings, concluded after extensive study that a significant number of the handprints could not have been made by human hands at all. The morphology, the specific shape, the finger proportions, the absence of a recognizable human thumb structure in some prints, pointed, her analysis suggested, toward a non-human origin. The prints, she proposed, may have been made using the feet or hands of animals, possibly reptiles, pressed into pigment and applied to the stone surface. This interpretation, while striking, raises its own set of questions. Why? What was the purpose of incorporating non-human animal prints into a rock art composition alongside human figures and recognizable animals? What cosmological or ritual framework would have made this a meaningful act? And if the ancient inhabitants of Wadi Sura were deliberately blending human and non-human impressions on the same surface, what does that tell us about how they understood the boundary between the human world and the animal world? Or whether they drew that boundary at all? Some researchers have looked at the handprints in the context of shamanic traditions documented across ancient cultures worldwide, frameworks in which the boundary between human and animal was understood to be permeable, in which ritual specialists could move between forms, and in which the act of marking that boundary on a surface was itself a sacred technology. In this reading, the strange hands at Wadi Sura are not anomalies. They are evidence of a sophisticated symbolic system that simply does not map neatly onto the categories modern archaeology was built to recognize. Others are less comfortable with that resolution. A minority of voices, careful and fully aware of how easily such suggestions are dismissed, have noted that the morphology of certain prints resists explanation even within the animal impression framework, that some of the dimensions and configurations do not correspond cleanly to any local fauna that has been identified, that the question of what exactly made these marks has not been answered to the satisfaction of everyone who has studied them closely. The Gilf Kabir Plateau is one of the most remote and inaccessible places on Earth. The people who painted these walls lived in a world that has since literally dried up and blown away. Their language is gone. Their stories are gone. The ecological context that gave their images meaning has been replaced by thousands of years of silence and sand. What remains are the marks themselves, human figures floating in water that no longer exists, animals rendered with a care that suggests deep familiarity, and those hands, pressed into ochre, applied to stone, preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the desert air, looking out from the rock face with a patience that outlasted everything. Whose hands were they? And what were they reaching for? There is something particular about hands pressed against stone in the dark. The directness of the gesture, the refusal to be forgotten, the insistence on presence even in a world that has long since moved on. The people of Wadi Sura reached out and touched the rock face, and across 10,000 years that touch has held. But most ancient civilizations did not leave us single gestures. They left us entire worlds, cities, ports, systems of commerce and governance and daily life that functioned with extraordinary complexity for centuries, and then, with a speed that still confounds explanation, simply stopped. Not every ending announces itself. Some civilizations do not fall with the crash of conquest or the spectacle of fire. Some simply go quiet. The activity slows. The ships stop coming. The streets empty gradually, then completely. And when the silence finally settles, it is total, leaving behind only the physical remnants of everything that was, arranged in the stillness like objects in a room whose occupants stepped out and never returned. In the state of Gujarat, on the northwestern coast of India, near the place where the Sabarmati River once met the Gulf of Khambhat, there is a low mound of ancient earth that archaeologists call Lothal. It is not a dramatic landscape. The land is flat, the vegetation sparse, the horizon wide and unassuming. Nothing about the surface of this place prepares you for what was once here. But beneath that ordinary ground lies one of the most technically sophisticated urban sites of the ancient world, a city that, at its height around 2400 BC, stood at the center of a maritime trading network that connected the Indian subcontinent to Mesopotamia, to the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Lothal was a port, but not simply a port in the way we might casually use the word. It contained what archaeologists believe to be the oldest known artificial dock in the world. A massive rectangular basin, approximately 200 meters long and 36 meters wide, cut from the earth and lined with fired brick to a standard of construction that is, by any measure, remarkable for its era. The dock was engineered with an understanding of tidal patterns, water management, and structural load that required not just skilled labor, but accumulated technical knowledge, the kind that develops over generations of observation and refinement. The city that surrounded the dock was equally ordered. Lothal was laid out on a grid. Its residential and commercial areas were separated with a deliberateness that implies urban planning in the formal sense. It had a drainage system, covered channels running beneath the streets to carry wastewater away from living areas, that would not have looked out of place in a much later civilization. Its warehouses, positioned strategically near the dock, contained standardized weights and measures, evidence of a commercial culture operating with a precision that required shared conventions across trading partners who may have been hundreds of miles apart. Beads of carnelian, gold, and semi-precious stones have been recovered from Lothal's workshops, objects of such quality that they were clearly destined for distant markets. Seals bearing the undeciphered script of the Indus Valley civilization have been found here, the same symbols that appear at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, linking Lothal to the broader cultural and commercial network of one of the ancient world's largest and most sophisticated civilizations. And then, somewhere around 1900 BC, it ended. The decline of Lothal mirrors, in its broad outlines, the decline of the entire Indus Valley civilization, a collapse so sweeping and so poorly understood that it remains one of the central unsolved problems of ancient history. Within a relatively short period, the major urban centers of the civilization were abandoned. The great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which had sustained populations of tens of thousands for centuries, emptied out. The standardized weights, the drainage systems, the grid-planned streets, the dock at Lothal, all of it ceased to function, ceased to be maintained, and was gradually reclaimed by the earth. The mainstream explanations are several, and none of them is entirely satisfying on its own. Climate change is the most widely cited factor, specifically a shift in monsoon patterns that reduced the rainfall on which the civilization's agriculture depended. The rivers that fed the Indus cities, including the now-vanished Saraswati River, whose drying course has been traced by satellite imagery, are believed to have changed course or diminished significantly during this period. Without reliable water, the agricultural foundation of urban life would have eroded, triggering migrations and the gradual dissolution of the social structures that kept cities functioning. Flooding is also implicated at Lothal specifically. The site shows evidence of successive flood deposits, layers of silt and debris that suggest the city was struck by major inundation events, possibly multiple times. Each flood would have damaged infrastructure, disrupted trade, and demanded reconstruction on a scale that may, over time, have exceeded the community's capacity to respond. But archaeologists who have studied the Indus collapse most closely note something that the climate and flood explanations do not fully address: the absence of evidence for violent conquest. Unlike many ancient urban collapses, the end of the Indus Valley civilization left no clear archaeological signature of warfare. No burned buildings, no mass graves, no weapons caches, no evidence of the kind of catastrophic violence that typically accompanies imperial collapse or invasion. The cities did not appear to be destroyed, they appeared to be left. This is, in some ways, more unsettling than destruction. Destruction implies an event, a moment, a cause. Abandonment implies a decision, made collectively, sustained over time by hundreds of thousands of people across an enormous geographic area, to simply walk away from everything that had been built. Where did they go? The population did not vanish. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests dispersal, movement eastward, inland, into the Gangetic Plain and beyond. The people survived. The civilization, in the form it had taken at Lothal and Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, did not. Some researchers have begun asking whether the collapse was less a failure than a transformation, whether the Indus people, facing environmental pressures they could not overcome, made a rational and perhaps even organized decision to decentralize, to disperse, to trade the complexity of urban life for the resilience of smaller, more mobile communities. If that is true, it reframes the silence of Lothal entirely. Not as a tragedy, not as a mystery without agency, but as a choice, deliberate, perhaps even wise, made by people who understood their situation more clearly than we have given them credit for. A civilization that knew when to let go. Or did they? Was the silence of Lothal a decision freely made, or the last exhale of a world that had simply run out of the conditions it needed to breathe? The dock sits empty now, its brick walls patient beneath the Gujarat sky. The ships are long gone. The merchants, the bead makers, the engineers who understood the tides, all dispersed into a history that never wrote their names down. What were they carrying on those last ships out? And did any of them look back? Perhaps that is the hardest kind of ending to absorb. Not the dramatic collapse, not the conquest, not the fire, but the quiet dispersal. The decision or the necessity to simply walk away from everything you built. The people of Lothal left their dock, their warehouses, their carefully laid streets, and moved toward a horizon that history has not clearly recorded. They made a choice, or had one made for them, and the world they left behind fell into silence. But Lothal, at least, gave us time. The evidence of its decline is spread across layers of silt and centuries of gradual change. What happened at the other end of the ancient world, on a windswept island at the very northwestern edge of Europe, was something different, something that feels, even across 5,000 years, considerably more abrupt. Off the northeastern coast of Scotland, where the North Atlantic meets the North Sea in a collision of cold gray water and unpredictable weather, lies a group of islands called Orkney. They are beautiful in the way that severe landscapes can be beautiful, open, elemental, stripped of everything unnecessary by wind and time. The light here has a quality unlike anywhere else in Britain, and the sense of standing at the boundary of something, between land and ocean, between the inhabited world and the vast empty north, is constant and physical. It was here, on the western shore of the Orkney mainland, that a storm in 1850 peeled back a grass-covered mound and revealed something that should not, by any reasonable expectation, have been there. Beneath the earth, preserved almost perfectly by the very sand that had buried it, was a village. Not ruins, not foundations, not the vague outlines that most ancient sites offer the archaeologist's trowel. A village, with walls still standing, with furniture still in place. With the stone hearths, the stone beds, the stone shelves and storage boxes of a community that had lived here in extraordinary intimacy with one another for over 6 centuries. Skara Brae. Older than Stonehenge. Older than the pyramids of Giza. A Neolithic settlement occupied from roughly 3180 BC to approximately 2500 BC, making it one of the best preserved prehistoric villages in all of Europe, and one of the most quietly astonishing places the ancient world has left us. The houses at Skara Brae are immediately, almost shockingly, familiar. Each dwelling is a single room, roughly square, built into and connected to its neighbors by a network of covered passageways that would have allowed the community to move between homes without exposing themselves to the brutal Orkney weather. At the center of each room is a hearth. Against the walls are stone beds, box-shaped enclosures that would have been filled with heather or animal skins. Opposite the entrance, in a position of apparent prominence, stands a stone dresser. A shelved structure that faces the doorway, the first thing you would see upon entering any home in the village. The consistency is striking. Every house follows the same layout. Every dresser occupies the same position. The community that built Skara Brae was not simply sharing a location. It was sharing a way of organizing domestic space that was, by every visible measure, deeply standardized and deeply intentional. For roughly 600 years, this worked. The people of Skara Brae fished, farmed, kept cattle, made pottery of a distinctive and sophisticated style, now called grooved ware, and created objects, carved stone balls of unknown purpose being among the most intriguing, that suggest a rich symbolic and possibly ritual life. They were not isolated. Evidence connects them to a broader Neolithic network across Britain and Ireland, a culture that was simultaneously raising the great stone circles and chambered tombs that still punctuate the British landscape. And then, around 2500 BC, they left. What the archaeological record shows at the moment of abandonment is what has made Skara Brae genuinely difficult to explain cleanly. The evidence does not suggest a planned, orderly departure. It suggests something faster than that, something that interrupted the ordinary rhythms of daily life before they could be properly concluded. Beads from a broken necklace were found scattered across the floor of one house, as if a string had snapped and there had been no time, or no inclination, to gather them. Everyday objects, tools, pottery, personal items were left in place, not packed, not taken. The hearths show signs of having been in use until very close to the moment the site was abandoned. These are not the traces of a community that spent weeks preparing to leave. They are the traces of a community that was here and then was not. The conventional explanation points to environmental crisis. Around 2500 BC, evidence suggests a significant deterioration in the climate of northern Scotland, a shift toward colder, wetter, stormier conditions that would have made life on an exposed coastal site increasingly difficult. A major storm event, some researchers propose, may have been the final catalyst, a dramatic inundation that made continued occupation of the site impossible or psychologically untenable, regardless of the physical damage it caused. This explanation is reasonable. Climate and storm events have ended human settlements throughout history, and the location of Skara Brae, directly on the coastal edge, exposed to the full force of North Atlantic weather, makes it plausible that a sufficiently violent storm could have driven the community away permanently. But the specifics of what was left behind continue to trouble that tidy resolution, because communities that flee storms typically return, to assess the damage, to recover what can be recovered, to rebuild if the land still supports it. The people of Skara Brae did not return, not even to collect the scattered beads, not even to retrieve the tools left neatly in the places they had always been kept. Whatever drove them from this village, the decision to never come back appears to have been immediate, total, and final. Some researchers have looked at the broader context of Neolithic Britain around 2500 BC, and noted that Skara Brae's abandonment coincides roughly with a period of significant cultural transition across the British Isles. The gradual shift from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age, the arrival of new populations with new technologies and new ways of organizing society. Whether the people of Skara Brae were displaced by this transition, absorbed into it, or simply chose to move toward it, is not something the stones can tell us. There are those who look at the carefully maintained uniformity of the village, the identical house layouts, the consistent placement of the dressers, the standardization that speaks of a community organized around shared rules and shared meaning, and ask whether the abandonment itself was also, in some sense, a collective ritual act, a deliberate closure. A community that had, for reasons we cannot recover, decided together that this place had served its purpose. The stone dresser in each house still faces the door. The hearths are cold, the beds are empty, and the beads lie where they fell, on a floor that no one has swept in 5,000 years. What did they see on that last day that made them leave everything behind? And wherever they went, did they ever stop looking back at the shore? They left without a word, without a grave marker, without a single inscription to tell us who they were or why they went. The people of Skara Brae walked away from their stone beds and their cold hearths and their scattered beads and disappeared into a Britain that was itself in the middle of becoming something new. What they believed, what they feared, what they loved, all of it went with them, carried in minds and memories that left no written record. And yet the impulse to be remembered, to leave something of yourself standing in the world after you are gone, is perhaps the most persistent impulse in all of human history. Some communities built stone circles, some carved tunnels, some sealed their greatest treasures behind iron doors and sacred warnings, and some, on a sun-baked limestone plateau on the western coast of an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, built giants. Sardinia is not a small island, but it carries itself with a certain self-contained intensity that sets it apart from the rest of the Mediterranean world. It has been inhabited since the deep Paleolithic, and its interior, even today, retains a quality of remoteness that feels older than the roads that cross it. It was here, beginning roughly in the 11th century BC, that a culture known as the Nuragic civilization reached a particular apex of artistic ambition, one that, for reasons archaeology has struggled to fully explain, was then buried, broken, and forgotten for nearly 3,000 years. In the spring of 1974, a farmer plowing a field near the village of Cabras, on Sardinia's western coast, struck something hard beneath the surface of the earth. What he had found was stone, carved stone, and as the field began to give up its contents over the weeks and months that followed, it became clear that what lay beneath that unremarkable agricultural land was extraordinary. The shattered remains of a collection of stone statues, unlike anything else known from the ancient Mediterranean world. The Monte Prama giants, as they came to be called, are not giants in the literal sense. The fragments, when reconstructed, suggest figures standing between 2 and 2.5 meters tall. But in the context of the ancient world, and particularly in the context of what was being produced elsewhere in the Mediterranean during the same period, they are genuinely monumental. They are the oldest large-scale stone sculptures ever found in the Western Mediterranean. They predate the great sculptural traditions of classical Greece. They predate, by centuries, anything comparable from the cultures that surrounded them. And they are deeply, consistently strange. The figures fall into recognizable categories. There are archers, their bows raised in a posture of readiness. There are warriors carrying shields. Not flat shields, but the distinctive round shields of the Nuragic culture, their surfaces divided into geometric sections with a precision that suggests symbolic meaning beyond simple military function. And there are boxers, figures whose raised arms bear the bulky cylindrical arm guards that Nuragic bronze figurines from the same period also depict. A detail so specific that it connects the Monte Prama sculptures directly to a broader material culture that archaeologists have been piecing together for decades. The eyes are what stay with you. Unlike the naturalistic treatment of the human face that would come to define Greek sculpture a few centuries later, the Monte Prama figures have eyes rendered as concentric circles, large, stylized, almost mechanical in their symmetry, staring outward with an intensity that is not quite human. They do not look at you the way a portrait looks at you. They look through you, or past you, toward something the sculptor understood and the viewer is not quite meant to access. The statues were found alongside a series of ancient tombs, the so-called giants' tombs of the Nuragic culture, collective burial monuments that the Nuragic people constructed across Sardinia for centuries. The association between the sculptures and the tombs strongly suggests a funerary or commemorative function. The figures, most researchers believe, were placed to guard or honor the dead. A permanent stone assembly of warriors, archers, and athletes standing watch over the burial ground of a community whose identity they were meant to embody and protect. But the circumstances in which they were found introduce a question that the Guardian interpretation alone cannot answer. The statues were not standing when they were discovered. They were broken, deliberately, systematically, and in a way that suggests not the random damage of time, but intentional destruction. The fragments were buried, not scattered. Someone, at some point, broke these figures apart and placed the pieces in the ground. Whether this was an act of conquest, of ritual closure, of deliberate erasure, or of something else entirely, is a question that the site itself does not clearly answer. The Nuragic civilization, which built the thousands of stone towers called Nuragi that still punctuate the Sardinian landscape, reached its height between roughly 1800 and 900 BC. After the first millennium BC, under pressure from Phoenician and later Carthaginian colonization of the island's coasts, Nuragic culture gradually retreated, transformed, and eventually ceased to exist as a distinct and coherent civilization. Whether the destruction of the Monte Prama statues was connected to this broader cultural displacement, an act of erasure by incoming powers, or an act of deliberate burial by the Nuragic people themselves, sealing their most sacred objects into the earth rather than allowing them to be desecrated, is something historians continue to debate without consensus. There are researchers who look at the sheer scale of the sculptural program at Monte Prama and argue that what has been found represents only a fraction of what was once there. The site has not been fully excavated. The surrounding area has yielded fragments in conditions suggesting that the original assembly of statues was considerably larger than what the 1974 discovery and subsequent excavations have recovered. How many figures once stood here, staring outward with their concentric circle eyes, is a number no one can currently give with confidence. A civilization built towers across an entire island. It cast hundreds of small bronze figures with a delicacy that still astonishes. It raised stone giants to guard its dead, and then it was pushed to the margins of its own world, its statues broken and buried, its name forgotten so completely that the figures lay in the earth for 3 millennia before a farmer's plow brought them back to light. They are reassembled now, standing again in a museum in Cagliari, their strange eyes looking out at a world that still does not fully understand them. What were they protecting? And does whatever they were guarding still lie beneath the fields of Cabras, waiting for the right question to bring it to the surface? There is something quietly devastating about a civilization that builds giants to guard its dead, only to have those giants broken and buried. The guardians themselves needing to be rescued, centuries later, by a farmer who wasn't even looking for them. The Nuragic people poured their understanding of the world into stone, raised it to human height and beyond, and watched it outlast everything else they built. What they could not control was the tide of history that eventually swallowed the context that gave those figures meaning. But some civilizations did not wait for history to swallow them. Some looked at the hardest environments on Earth and decided, with a calmness that borders on the audacious, that the environment itself was the answer, that the very hostility of the land, its dryness, its austerity, its apparent refusal to sustain life, was not an obstacle to be endured, but a problem to be solved. And in solving it, they built something so sophisticated, so quietly revolutionary, that we are still struggling to fully understand it 2,000 years after they were gone. In the desert landscape of what is now southern Jordan and the Negev region, an ancient territory stretching across modern Jordan and into the arid reaches of what is historically known as the southern Levant, including parts of present-day Palestine, there lived a people who should not, by any conventional environmental logic, have been able to build a civilization at all. The Nabateans, a culture that rose from nomadic origins sometime around the 4th century BC, established a trading empire of extraordinary reach and sophistication and built their capital, Petra, in a canyon of rose-red sandstone that remains even today one of the most breathtaking human-made environments on the planet. Everyone who knows Petra knows the treasury, the facade carved directly into the cliff face, its columns and pediments emerging from solid rock with a precision that still silences visitors on first sight. But the treasury, magnificent as it is architecture. What the Nabateans built in the landscape around their cities, in the wadis, on the hillsides, across the desert floors of one of the driest regions on Earth, is something harder to see, and in many ways more impressive. They built water. Not water itself, of course, but the infrastructure to find it, capture it, move it, store it, and distribute it across a landscape that receives, in some areas, less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year. The Nabatean water system was not a single structure or a single technology. It was a comprehensive landscape-scale intervention, an integrated network of dams, cisterns, channels, runoff farms, and distribution systems that transformed the desert from a place that could barely support a nomadic population into one that could sustain cities of tens of thousands. The technical sophistication of what they built is, even by modern engineering standards, remarkable. Nabatean engineers understood hydrology, the behavior of water moving across different surfaces, gathering speed, carrying sediment, seeking the lowest point, with a precision that could only have come from generations of careful observation. They cut channels into hillsides at gradients so precisely calculated that water moved through them at exactly the right speed, fast enough to flow, slow enough not to erode. They built small check dams in the floors of desert wadis that slowed flash floods to a near stop, forcing the water to spread across cultivated terraces rather than rushing through and evaporating uselessly downstream. They carved cisterns into bedrock that held water through the long, dry months between rains, sealed with plaster, so fine and so durable that some of them remained watertight for centuries after they were last maintained. In the Negev highlands alone, in a landscape that receives rainfall for perhaps 20 days a year, archaeologists have documented thousands of these runoff farms, each one a small masterpiece of applied environmental understanding. The Nabateans were not fighting the desert. They were reading it, working with its logic rather than against it, and extracting from its occasional generosity every drop it had to offer. At the height of their civilization, between roughly the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, this system sustained a population and an agricultural output that modern researchers have found genuinely difficult to replicate. Even with contemporary technology and a far more thorough understanding of the underlying hydrology. Experimental farms established in the Negev in the 20th century, attempting to reconstruct Nabatean runoff agriculture using documented ancient methods, have produced results that consistently surprise the agronomists involved. And then, with the absorption of the Nabatean kingdom into the Roman Empire in 106 AD, something began to change. The water systems did not collapse immediately. Under Roman administration, many of the Nabatean cities continued to function, and some of the infrastructure was maintained and even extended. But the knowledge that had built the system, the accumulated, generationally transmitted understanding of how to read a wadi, how to calculate a gradient, how to position a check dam for maximum effect, was embedded not in written manuals, but in people, in communities, in the practical expertise of engineers and farmers who had grown up within a living tradition of desert water management. As that tradition was disrupted by the political reorganization of Roman annexation, by population movements, by the gradual erosion of the specific social structures that had carried the knowledge forward. The system began to falter, not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, in the way that complex systems fail when the expertise required to maintain them is no longer reliably transmitted. By the Byzantine period, many of the Nabatean water installations had fallen into disrepair. By the early Islamic period, the landscape that had once supported thriving agricultural communities had reverted, in significant portions, to desert. The infrastructure was still physically present. The channels, the cisterns, the check dams, all still visible in the landscape if you knew how to look. But the knowledge of how to operate it as an integrated system had, to a very large degree, been lost. This is what makes the Nabatean water story so persistently troubling. It was not the system itself that disappeared. It was the understanding of the system. The technology survived in stone, The knowledge that gave the stone its meaning did not. How much of what the Nabateans understood about their landscape remains encoded in those channels and cisterns, waiting, essentially, to be relearned by people patient enough to read what they built as the technical document it actually is. And in a world increasingly confronted with water scarcity, drought, and the expanding reach of desert conditions, is it possible that a civilization that mastered these problems 2,000 years ago still has something to teach us? If we are willing to stop long enough to listen to what they left behind, the channels are still there, cut into the hillsides of the ancient Negev. The cisterns are still there, sealed and silent beneath the desert floor. The water, when the rain comes, still flows. It simply has nowhere left to go. The Nabateans left their knowledge in stone, in gradients and channels and cisterns that still hold the logic of a water system the modern world has not fully decoded. What they understood about the desert, they encoded in the landscape itself, trusting that the land would preserve what human memory could not. And in that trust, they were right. The stone endured. It is we who lost the fluency to read it. But the Nabateans were not the first people to write their understanding of the desert into the earth. Thousands of years before the first Nabatean engineer calculated the slope of a hillside channel, other hands were moving across the same landscapes, not building systems to capture water, but systems to capture something else entirely. Something that moved and breathed and could be turned into food and hide and bone. From the air, they appear without warning, and when they do, they stop you. Spread across the desert landscapes of Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the broader Arabian Peninsula, and extending into parts of the ancient Levant, including territory across present-day Palestine, there are structures so large that they are effectively invisible from the ground. You can stand beside one of their walls, a low line of stones no more than knee-height, and see nothing unusual. You can walk along its edge for 100 meters and still not understand what you are part of. It is only from altitude, first from the cockpits of early aircraft in the 1920s, later from satellites, most recently from the comprehensive eye of aerial survey, that their true form becomes apparent. They are called desert kites, not because they fly, but because of their shape. A long, narrow funnel of two converging stone walls, stretching sometimes for several kilometers across the desert floor, opening at one end into a wide mouth and narrowing at the other into an enclosure, sometimes circular, sometimes irregular, always deliberate. From above, the silhouette is unmistakable. A kite, a trap, a machine built from stone and landscape, and an understanding of animal behavior so precise that it functioned, in principle, with a simplicity that belies the sophistication required to design it. The basic mechanics are not difficult to reconstruct. Herds of gazelle, ibex, or other migratory animals moving across the desert landscape would encounter the outer walls of the structure, low enough not to alarm, but present enough to influence direction. Guided by the walls, the animals would funnel gradually inward, the passage narrowing almost imperceptibly until they entered the enclosure at the narrow end. There they could be killed efficiently, in numbers large enough to supply a community with meat, hide, sinew, and bone for extended periods. This is the mainstream understanding, and it is well supported by the physical evidence. The structures are hunting traps. This much is not seriously in dispute. What is in dispute, what remains genuinely open and genuinely fascinating, is almost everything else about them. The scale of the desert kite network is something that takes time to absorb. These are not isolated structures. They are not the work of a single community or a single generation. Across the Arabian and Levantine deserts, researchers have now documented thousands of individual kites. Some estimates suggest the total number may exceed 10,000, spread across an area of several million square kilometers. They vary in size, in age, in construction detail, and in the specific configuration of their enclosures. Some are simple, Some are extraordinarily complex, with multiple enclosure chambers, internal subdivisions, and auxiliary walls that suggest a level of operational sophistication well beyond basic opportunistic hunting. The oldest examples, based on current dating evidence, appear to extend back to at least 9000 BC, placing their origins in the late Neolithic, at a time when the climate of the Arabian Peninsula was considerably wetter and more hospitable than it is today. The most recent examples appear to have been in use as late as the first few centuries AD. This means the desert kite tradition, in its broadest sense, spans an almost incomprehensible stretch of human time. Perhaps 11,000 years of continuous or recurring use across multiple cultures, multiple climatic periods, and multiple phases of human technological development. No single civilization built all of these structures. They represent the accumulated hunting infrastructure of dozens of cultures across a time frame longer than the entire span of recorded history. And yet, viewed from above, the kites share a consistency of basic design logic that suggests either continuous cultural transmission across those millennia, or independent convergent discovery of the same fundamental principle by people separated by vast distances and thousands of years. Both possibilities are, in their own way, remarkable. Researchers studying the aerial distribution of the kites have noted something that goes beyond their individual function. The structures are not randomly scattered across the landscape. They are positioned with a spatial logic, oriented relative to known animal migration routes, positioned at topographic pinch points where terrain naturally channeled animal movement, arranged in sequences that suggest coordinated use across distances far greater than any single community could have managed alone. This last point has attracted particular attention. Some of the kite sequences in Jordan and Saudi Arabia extend across landscapes so vast that operating them as functional hunting systems would have required coordination between multiple groups, a shared understanding of the timing of animal migrations, a communication system capable of synchronizing activity across dozens of kilometers, and a social structure capable of organizing collective effort at a scale that challenges the conventional picture of Neolithic and early Bronze Age desert peoples as small, isolated, nomadic bands. Who organized this? How did communities separated by desert distances coordinate the use of structures that, to work efficiently, required simultaneous human presence at multiple points across a landscape? The logistical questions are not trivial, and they have not been answered. There are researchers who look at the complexity of the kite networks and argue that they imply a level of social organization, of communication, coordination, and shared territorial understanding that archaeology has systematically underestimated in pre-urban desert cultures. That the people who built and used these structures were not the simple, scattered nomads of the conventional picture, but communities with sophisticated social networks, territorial agreements, and collective management systems that left no trace in the written record, because writing had not yet been invented. Others go further, pointing to certain kite configurations, particularly the more complex multi-chamber examples found in Jordan, and asking whether the structures served purposes beyond hunting. Certain enclosure designs seem disproportionate to the practical requirements of containing and killing animals. Some kites appear to have been built, or modified, in ways that reduce their efficiency as hunting traps while increasing their visual complexity as seen from above. A detail that has prompted the careful and carefully hedged suggestion that at least some of these structures may have carried symbolic or ritual significance alongside their practical function. Why build something to be seen from a perspective that no human in the ancient world could have occupied? Why invest the labor required to create visual complexity that is only apparent from the air? The desert holds these questions the way it holds everything, in a stillness that is not emptiness, but patience. The kite walls are still there, low lines of stone half buried by millennia of wind-blown sand, invisible at ground level, astonishing from above. Somewhere in the gap between those two perspectives, between what could be seen and what could not, lies an answer that has not yet been recovered. What did the people who built them understand about this landscape that we are only now, from satellites and aircraft, beginning to see for ourselves? There is something that changes in you when you realize that the most significant things are often the least visible. The desert kite builders understood this intuitively. They created structures that could only be fully comprehended from a perspective their makers could never have occupied, encoding meaning into a scale that transcended the individual human viewpoint entirely. They built for an eye that did not yet exist, or perhaps for one they believed was always watching. Either way, the full picture was always there. It simply required the right distance to see it. And distance, it turns out, is also what it takes to appreciate what was carved into a flat slab of rock on the outskirts of what is now one of Scotland's largest cities. Not the distance of altitude, but the distance of time. And the peculiar, melancholy distance that comes from knowing that something extraordinary exists, that it has been documented and studied and marveled at, and that it is now, deliberately, buried. On the western edge of Clydebank, in the shadow of the urban sprawl that grew up around Glasgow during the industrial era, there is a field. Unremarkable in every visible sense. Grass, open sky, the particular gray-green of a Scottish afternoon. Beneath that field, under several feet of deliberately placed soil, lies a flat sandstone outcrop approximately 13 meters by 8 meters in area, and across virtually every inch of its upper surface, carved into the rock with a patience and a purposefulness that still communicates itself across 5,000 years, are symbols. The Cockno Stone. Dated to approximately 3000 BC, making it a contemporary of Skara Brae and the early phases of Stonehenge. Containing over 90 carved cup and ring marks, concentric circles radiating outward from central depressions, connected in some cases by carved channels, arranged across the stone surface in a composition that is neither random nor, to modern eyes, immediately legible. It is the largest and most complex example of this type of prehistoric rock art in Europe. And since 1965, it has been underground. The cup and ring mark is one of the most widespread and persistent symbols in the prehistoric world. Versions of it appear in Scotland, Ireland, northern England, Brittany, the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia, and beyond, carved into rock faces, stone slabs, and standing stones across a geographic range so vast that it cannot be explained by simple cultural diffusion from a single source. People who had, as far as we know, no contact with one another were making the same basic mark, at roughly the same period of human history, in locations separated by thousands of miles of ocean and land. What does it mean? This is the question that has occupied researchers since the marks were first studied systematically in the 19th century, and it remains, with remarkable stubbornness, unanswered. The theories are numerous, and each carries a degree of plausibility that makes choosing between them genuinely difficult. Some researchers have proposed astronomical interpretations. That the concentric rings map celestial phenomena, that specific configurations correspond to lunar cycles or solar positions, that the stones functioned as a kind of sky calendar inscribed into the landscape for communities whose survival depended on understanding seasonal patterns with precision. Certain alignments at specific sites appear to support this reading, though the evidence is not consistent enough across all examples to constitute proof. Others have proposed territorial or mapping functions, that the marks denote landscape features, water sources, or boundaries, encoding geographic information in a symbolic language that subsequent generations lost the key to. At some sites, the spatial arrangement of the marks does appear to bear a loose correspondence to the surrounding topography, though whether this is intentional or coincidental is a question that honest researchers answer with careful uncertainty. There are those who approach the marks through the lens of altered states and shamanic practice, pointing to the neuropsychological research of figures like David Lewis Williams, whose work on entoptic phenomena suggests that the concentric circle is one of a small number of geometric forms that the human visual cortex generates during trance states, regardless of cultural background. In this reading, the cup and ring marks are not maps of the sky or the land, but maps of inner experience, records of visionary states that held religious or ritual significance for the communities that produced them. The Cockno Stone, with its exceptional density and complexity of marking, sits at the center of all these interpretations without being fully explained by any of them. It was first formally documented in 1887 by a local minister named James Harvey, who recognized immediately that what he was looking at was significant. In the decades that followed, the stone attracted researchers, artists, and antiquarians who produced drawings and early photographs of its surface. By the early 20th century, it was recognized as one of the most important prehistoric monuments in Scotland. It was also being damaged. As the industrial communities of Clydebank expanded around it, the stone became accessible to the kind of casual human contact that prehistoric rock art does not survive well. Graffiti appeared. Sections were chipped. Visitors walked across the surface with a casualness that eroded details that had survived 5,000 years of weather. By the 1960s, the deterioration had reached a point where a decision had to be made. In 1965, archaeologists and heritage authorities covered the Cocknow stone with approximately 1.5 meters of soil. The burial was framed as protection, a way of preserving the stone from further damage until the technology and resources existed to properly conserve it in situ or move it to a protected environment. The logic was sound. The stone is, by all accounts, better preserved beneath the earth than it was when exposed to the public. But there is an irony in this that sits uncomfortably. A stone that was carved 5,000 years ago to communicate something, to be seen, to be read, to transmit meaning across whatever distance its makers intended, has been hidden by the very civilization that recognizes its importance. We buried it to save it. And in saving it, we have placed it beyond the reach of the question it was made to answer. In 2016, a team from the University of Glasgow temporarily re-excavated the stone and used photogrammetry and 3D scanning technology to produce the most detailed record of its surface ever made. What the scanning revealed surprised even experienced researchers. Additional marks, previously undocumented, visible only under the specific lighting conditions that the new technology could generate. The stone, even after more than a century of study, was still yielding new information. It is covered again now, back under its protective layer of soil in the field on the edge of Clydebank, beneath the Scottish sky. Somewhere in that composition of circles and channels and carved depressions, in a symbolic language that no living person can read with certainty, a message is waiting. The same message it has always been waiting to deliver, since the hands that made it lifted from the stone and the makers walked away into a world we cannot recover. What were they trying to tell us? And are we, even now, looking at it from close enough, or far enough, to understand? There is a particular kind of grief that comes with an undeciphered message. The Cocknow stone sits beneath its protective soil, its circles and channels carved with unmistakable intention, transmitting something across 5,000 years that we can feel the weight of without being able to name. We know it meant something. We know it was important enough to be made permanent, to be placed in the open landscape where it could be found and seen and returned to. And still, the specific content of that meaning remains just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to come. But the Cocknow stone, at least, is a single object in a single place. What happens when the undeciphered message is not carved in rock, but woven into fiber? Not fixed to a landscape, but carried in the hands, passed between people, shipped across trade routes, and produced in quantities that suggest not a ceremonial rarity, but a functional, everyday technology of communication. What happens when the message is everywhere, and we still cannot read it? In the Soup Valley of coastal Peru, approximately 180 kilometers north of Lima, there is an ancient city that rewrote what historians believe they knew about the development of civilization in the Americas. Corral. Occupied from roughly 2600 BC to around 2000 BC, making it the oldest known urban center in the Western Hemisphere. A contemporary, in the most literal chronological sense, of the Great Pyramid building era in ancient Egypt and the flourishing of the Indus Valley civilization at Lothal and Mohenjo-Daro. Corral was not a small settlement. It covered over 60 hectares and contained massive platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, residential complexes, and evidence of a sophisticated social and economic organization that supported a population of thousands. And Corral did something that continues to unsettle the conventional picture of what a civilization requires in order to be a civilization. It built all of this without pottery, without metal tools, and as far as the conventional record shows, without writing, at least without writing in any form that modern scholarship has been able to recognize as such. Or so it seemed, until the quipus. A quipu, the word comes from the Quechua language of the later Inca civilization, is an object made of fiber. A primary cord from which hang numerous secondary cords, each of which may carry tertiary cords and so on through multiple levels of branching. The cords are knotted. The knots vary in type, position, and clustering. The fibers vary in color, in material, in twist direction. The spacing between knots varies. The length of cords varies. The relationship between cords on the same level and between levels varies. Every one of these variables, researchers have established with confidence, was meaningful, was, in the language of information systems, a data-bearing element. The Inca used quipus extensively, and in their case, the primary function is reasonably well understood. Inca quipus recorded numerical information, census data, tribute tallies, agricultural outputs, military inventories, using a base 10 positional system encoded in the type and placement of knots. They were, in essence, a tactile abacus combined with a filing system, operated by specialist record keepers called quipucamayaks, whose training and role were formally recognized within Inca administrative structure. When quipus were found at Corral, predating the Inca by more than 3,000 years, making them among the oldest examples of this type of object ever discovered anywhere. The initial assumption was continuity. A technology that the Inca used for accounting had ancient roots, and what was found at Corral represented an early, perhaps simpler version of the same numerical recording system. But the Corral quipus, as researchers examined them more carefully, did not cooperate with this tidy narrative. The structure of the Corral examples differs from the Inca administrative quipu in ways that are subtle but significant. The complexity of the branching, the variability of the fiber treatments, the specific configurations of certain knot types. These features have led some researchers to a conclusion that, once stated, is difficult to dismiss. The Corral quipus may not be numerical records at all. They may be something else, something that the Inca numerical quipu descended from, or diverged from, or simply coexisted alongside for millennia. A form of encoded information that goes beyond accounting. The word that researchers use, cautiously but with increasing frequency, is language, narrative. The possibility that the quipu, in its ancient form, was not merely a recording device for quantities, but a medium for storing and transmitting complex information. Stories, histories, ritual knowledge, the kind of content that other civilizations encoded in written symbols on flat surfaces. Harvard researcher Gary Urton spent years developing a system for cataloging quipu variables, identifying over 20 distinct binary features in each knot that, in combination, generate a theoretical encoding capacity comparable to written script. His work suggested that the quipu, properly understood, was not a simple accounting tool, but a system rich enough to carry the full range of human communicative content. Not a ledger, a library. If this is correct, and it remains a hypothesis, not a consensus, then the implications for Corral specifically are extraordinary. A civilization that built monumental architecture, sustained thousands of people, and participated in long-distance trade networks. Doing all of this not in the absence of writing, but in the presence of a writing system. So different from anything in the Old World tradition that it took modern scholarship 4,000 years to begin to recognize it as such. The Spanish colonial destruction of Quipus, following the conquest of the Inca Empire, removed from the world an unknown but certainly enormous quantity of this potential record. Thousands of quipus were burned by colonial authorities who recognized them correctly as repositories of cultural and religious knowledge that competed with the new order they were imposing. What survived is a fraction of what existed, and of that fraction, The portion that has been decoded in any meaningful sense is smaller still. The coral quipus sit in that silence, fiber objects from a city older than almost anything else in the Americas, knotted with information that 5,000 years of history has not yet given us the key to unlock. They are not stone. They are not permanent in the way that carvings are permanent. They survived by accident, preserved in the dry coastal climate of the Supi Valley, when countless others did not. Each knot was tied by a hand that knew exactly what it meant. That knowledge passed from teacher to student for generations, possibly for millennia, until the chain of transmission was finally broken. By conquest, by time, by the particular violence that civilizations sometimes visit upon the records of the ones they replace. The knots are still there. The hands that could read them are gone. What stories did they hold? And is there, somewhere in the surviving corpus of these fiber records, a voice still waiting to be heard? If only we can learn again how to listen. There is a particular kind of loss that comes not from destruction, but from disconnection. The quipus of coral survived the millennia. The fiber held, the knots remained tied, the encoded information endured the slow patience of time. What was lost was not the message, but the reader. The chain of human transmission that carried the meaning forward was broken, and in that break, a library became a mystery. The objects remained. The context that gave them life did not. And this, it turns out, is one of the most recurring patterns in the archaeology of the ancient world. Not the disappearance of things, but the disappearance of the framework that made things meaningful. Objects surface from the earth, intact and eloquent, radiating a significance that is unmistakable and yet impossible to fully name. They tell you with absolute certainty that they mattered. They simply cannot tell you why. In the desert regions of what is now Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and northern Iran, the ancient territory known to classical historians as Bactria and Margiana, a crossroads landscape where the great civilizational currents of the ancient world met and mingled. There exists a category of object that embodies this problem with unusual precision. They began appearing on the international antiquities market in the late 1970s and early 1980s, surfacing initially without provenance, without excavation records, without the contextual documentation that gives an archaeological find its full meaning. They came most likely from illegal digging at sites in Afghanistan and the surrounding region during a period when political upheaval had made organized archaeological work nearly impossible, and the market for unprovenanced ancient objects was largely unregulated. They are composite figurines, small, typically between 15 and 25 centimeters in height, and constructed from multiple materials joined together with a sophistication that stops you when you first encounter them. The bodies are carved from chlorite, a dark, fine-grained stone that takes detail with extraordinary precision. The heads, hands, and feet are carved separately from white calcite or alabaster, the pale stone creating a deliberate, striking contrast against the dark torso. Some examples incorporate inlaid eyes of lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that in the ancient world functioned as a marker of the sacred, of the celestial, of value beyond the merely material. The garments carved into the chlorite surfaces are rendered with a textural detail that communicates not just the presence of clothing, but its quality, its weight, its specific construction. These are not simple cult figurines. They are objects of considerable artistic and technical ambition, produced by craftspeople who had mastered multiple materials and possessed an aesthetic sensibility that was, by any standard, highly developed. They are also almost entirely without explanation. The civilization that produced them is known to archaeologists as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, sometimes called the Oxus civilization, after the ancient name of the river that runs through the region. It flourished from roughly 2300 to 1700 BC, occupying a zone of fortified oasis settlements across the desert landscapes of Central Asia. It was a literate, urban, long-distance trading culture with connections that extended west to Mesopotamia, south to the Indus Valley, and east toward China. It was, in other words, one of the great Bronze Age civilizations of the ancient world, and yet it remains, by the standards of what we know about its contemporaries, extraordinarily obscure. Its script, if it had one in the conventional sense, has not been identified. Its language is unknown. Its religious beliefs are inferred primarily from iconography and material culture, with no textual tradition to anchor interpretation. The figurines, recovered largely without excavation context, exist in a scholarly environment where almost every question about their meaning must be approached through inference, analogy, and carefully maintained uncertainty. What is not uncertain is their significance. The labor required to produce a single composite figurine, the sourcing of multiple materials from geographically distant locations, the skilled carving of each component, the assembly and joining, represents an investment of resources that places these objects firmly in the category of the extraordinary. They were not everyday objects. They were not casual dedications. Whatever purpose they served, it was important enough to justify the expenditure of considerable wealth and craft skill. The conventional interpretation is religious. The figurines are understood by most researchers as representations of a divine or semi-divine female figure, a goddess, or a category of sacred feminine power, worshipped within the religious framework of the Oxus civilization. Parallels are drawn to other female figurine traditions in the ancient world, to the so-called Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, to the female cult figures of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. And the Bactrian examples are placed within this broader tradition of feminine sacred imagery that runs as a thread through the prehistoric and early historic world. This interpretation is reasonable. It fits the visual evidence. It aligns with what we know of Bronze Age religious practice in neighboring cultures, and it provides a functional context for objects whose level of craftsmanship implies ceremonial rather than domestic use. But it leaves specific questions unanswered that the objects themselves seem to demand. The garments carved into the chlorite bodies are not generic. They are specific, rendered with a detail that suggests the carvers were depicting actual textiles, actual styles of dress, actual conventions of appearance that carried meaning within their cultural context. Some examples show what appear to be ritual garments, with decorative elements that recur consistently enough across the known corpus to suggest standardized ceremonial dress rather than individual artistic variation. If these are representations of a goddess, she is a goddess depicted in very specific clothes that someone, somewhere, knew how to make and wore for a particular purpose. Who wore these garments? Were the figurines representations of a deity or of human ritual specialists? Priestesses, perhaps, whose role and appearance were important enough to be commemorated in this extraordinarily labor-intensive form. Were they votive objects, deposited at shrines? Grave goods placed with the dead to accompany them into whatever the Oxus civilization believed came next? Diplomatic objects exchanged between elites across the trading networks that connected Bactria to the rest of the Bronze Age world? The honest answer is that we do not know. The figurines that entered the market without excavation context carry no answers to these questions. Only the questions themselves, pressed into chlorite and calcite with a permanence that has outlasted every explanation. They stand in museum cases and private collections around the world now, these pale-faced women in their dark stone garments, their lapis eyes looking outward with an expression that resists easy categorization. Not serene, not fierce, not welcoming. Something more neutral than any of those, and somehow more unsettling for it. They knew who they were. They knew what they meant. That knowledge was carried in the living tradition that created them and has not survived the distance between that world and this one. What were these women? Divine or human? Goddess or priestess? Sacred or sovereign? And is the answer somewhere in the ground that has not yet been properly excavated, waiting, as these objects have always waited, for the right moment to be found? The Bactrian figurines stand in their cases with their lapis eyes and their specific unknowable garments, and what they ask of us, ultimately, is a kind of humility. the admission that significance can be unmistakable and meaning still unreachable, that an object can communicate its own importance across 4,000 years with absolute clarity while keeping its specific content entirely private. We know these figures mattered. We know they were made with intention, with skill, with the investment of real resources by real people who understood exactly what they were doing. What we cannot recover is the interior logic of that understanding. But there is another category of ancient mystery that takes this problem and turns it inside out. Not objects whose meaning is hidden because their context was lost, but objects whose context is known, whose archaeological circumstances have been carefully documented, and whose meaning remains elusive precisely because what was done to them was so deliberate, so systematic, and so far outside the frameworks of meaning that modern scholarship is accustomed to working with. Sometimes the mystery is not in what was preserved. It is in what was broken. In the southern Aegean Sea, among the scatter of islands that make up the Cyclades, there is a small uninhabited island called Keros. It is not a large island, roughly 3 square kilometers of rocky terrain rising from the sea, with no freshwater source and no harbor capable of supporting permanent habitation. By every practical measure, it is not a place where people should have gathered in significant numbers. And yet, between approximately 2800 and 2300 BC, something happened on Keros that has no clear parallel anywhere in the ancient Aegean world, and that archaeologists, despite decades of careful excavation, have not been able to explain to universal satisfaction. They gathered there in their thousands, not to live. The island could not support permanent settlement, but to deposit, to bring things to this specific, impractical, sea-surrounded place, and to leave those things behind. What they brought were the objects now known as Cycladic figurines, the abstract, elegant marble sculptures produced by the early Bronze Age cultures of the Cycladic Islands that have, in the modern era, become some of the most recognizable images of ancient art. You have seen them, even if you did not know their name. The long oval faces, the folded arms, the simplified forms that reduce the human body to a series of clean geometric relationships. They influenced Picasso. They influenced Brancusi. They sit in the world's great museums as objects of serene, formal beauty, celebrated for an aesthetic quality that feels, to modern eyes, almost contemporary. But the figurines brought to Keros were not brought whole. This is the fact that changes everything. Of the thousands of figurine fragments recovered from Keros, the site has yielded one of the largest concentrations of Cycladic material anywhere in the ancient Aegean. Virtually none are complete. They are pieces. Arms separated from torsos, heads removed from bodies, legs broken at the knee or the hip, the marble shattered or cleanly fractured in patterns that physical analysis has shown occurred before the objects arrived on the island. Not through burial, not through the pressure of earth and time, but through deliberate breakage carried out prior to deposition. The missing pieces are not on Keros. Excavations have been extensive and systematic enough to establish this with reasonable confidence. The other halves, the heads that belong to the torsos, the arms that were separated from the bodies, are elsewhere. At other sites across the Cyclades, fragments have been found that physical and chemical analysis has matched with remarkable precision to fragments from Keros. The objects were broken somewhere else, the pieces were divided, and then specific fragments, not random selections, but chosen portions, were carried to this uninhabited island and deposited there. The question that this pattern generates is one that archaeology can document but cannot yet fully answer. Why? The mainstream interpretation, supported by the most careful and systematic work done at the site, including the Cambridge Keros project led by Colin Renfrew and his colleagues, frames the island as a regional sanctuary, a sacred place, recognized as such by communities across the Cyclades, to which people brought deliberate deposits as acts of religious or communal significance. The breaking of the figurines in this reading was part of the ritual, a transformation of the object from its ordinary state into something appropriate for deposition, in the same way that many ancient cultures destroyed or altered objects before offering them to the sacred realm. This interpretation fits much of the evidence, and it is the position of most serious researchers working on the site. But within that framework, the specific logic of the breakage remains unexplained. Why divide the fragments? Why carry some pieces to Kairos and leave the matching pieces at the place of origin? If the act of breaking was a ritual transformation, what did the separation of the pieces mean? Was it a form of connection, a material link maintained between the sanctuary and the community that made the deposit, the fragment on Kairos and the fragment at home forming a kind of bond across the sea? Was it a record? Each fragment at home a marker of participation in something larger, a physical reminder of a journey made and a deposit left on a windswept island that no one permanently inhabited? Or was the breaking itself the point, the destruction of wholeness a specific ritual technology, understood within a cosmological framework that we have not recovered, achieving something that the intact object could not? There are researchers who have examined the patterns of breakage at Kairos in relation to the specific body parts that were separated and deposited, and who have noted that certain fragments, heads in particular, appear with a frequency that suggests something more than random selection. The head, in many ancient symbolic systems, carried a concentrated form of the identity or power of the whole. If the Cycladic communities of the early Bronze Age held a version of this belief, the deposit of heads at Kairos might have been a very specific act, the sending of essence to a sacred place, while the body remained with the living community that had made the object. Kairos was used as a sanctuary for perhaps 500 years, then apparently abandoned. No evidence of later occupation has been found that suggests the tradition continued past approximately 2300 BC. Whatever the ritual was, it ended. Whatever the community of practice that maintained it, it dissolved or transformed into something that left different traces in the ground. The island sits in the Aegean now as it always has. Small, rocky, unremarkable to the passing eye, inhabited only by wind and the particular quality of Aegean light that makes everything look ancient, even when it is not. Beneath its surface, in the deposits that have been excavated and those that have not, the broken pieces continue to wait. Each fragment the other half of something that lies in a different location, connected across the sea by an act of deliberate separation that was meaningful enough to repeat, collectively, for 5 centuries. What were they completing in the breaking? And what did it mean for the people who carried the pieces home to hold in their hands only half of what had once been whole? There is something about the act of deliberate breaking, of taking a whole thing and dividing it with intention, distributing the pieces across a geography of meaning, that suggests a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between objects and the forces they were believed to carry. The Cycladic communities who brought their broken figurines to Kairos were not destroying meaning. They were relocating it, redistributing it, maintaining a connection across water between the fragment left at home and the fragment deposited on an uninhabited island that existed, it seems, for precisely this purpose. The wholeness was not lost. It was simply held in 2 places at once. This instinct, to invest objects with significance that transcends their physical form, to treat the made thing as a vessel for something larger than itself, appears, with remarkable consistency, across the ancient world. It does not require writing. It does not require monumental architecture. It does not require a state or an empire. It requires only the human capacity to look at a shaped piece of stone or fiber or marble and understand it as a point of contact between the visible world and whatever lies beyond visibility. But sometimes, the objects themselves resist every framework we bring to them. Sometimes what was made in the ancient world is strange, not because its meaning is hidden, but because its very existence raises questions that the conventional history of human technology cannot comfortably answer. On the high Andean plateau of Bolivia, at an elevation of nearly 3,900 meters above sea level, on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, there is a site that has been puzzling archaeologists since systematic investigation began there in the 19th century. Tiwanaku, the ceremonial and administrative center of one of the most expansive pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, a culture that dominated the Andean highlands from approximately 500 AD to around 1000 AD, and whose influence, through trade, through religious authority, through the movement of people and ideas, extended across a vast geographic area encompassing parts of what are now Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. Tiwanaku is known for its monumental stonework, the Acapana Pyramid, the Kalasasaya Temple enclosure, the Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite with a precision that still generates genuine astonishment in those who examine it closely. The site's builders worked at altitude, with stone sourced from quarries located across Lake Titicaca, transported by water, and then moved overland to a construction site that sits almost 4 kilometers above sea level, a logistical achievement that remains incompletely explained. But it is not the monumental architecture that introduces the deepest uncertainty. It is something considerably smaller and considerably stranger. Among the objects recovered from Tiwanaku and its surrounding sites, in excavations that have been ongoing, with varying degrees of systematic rigor for over a century, there are stone cylinders, not large, typically ranging from a few centimeters to perhaps 20 or 30 centimeters in length. Carefully shaped, precisely worked, and in certain examples finished to a standard of surface smoothness that is, given the tools conventionally attributed to the Tiwanaku culture, genuinely difficult to account for. The cylinders vary in form. Some are simple, uniform in diameter along their length, their surfaces worked to a reasonable smoothness without obvious decorative intent. Others are more complex, tapering, grooved, or bearing surface treatments that suggest a specific functional or symbolic purpose. A small number of examples have attracted sustained attention from researchers precisely because of the quality of their finish. Surfaces so smooth, geometries so precise, that the conventional toolkit of stone, bone, and copper, implements typically assigned to pre-Columbian Andean cultures, strains to explain how they were produced. The mainstream archaeological interpretation is cautious and appropriately restrained. Cylindrical stone objects with worked surfaces are known from numerous ancient contexts, and their functions range from the obviously practical, rollers, weights, pestles, components of mechanical systems, to the clearly ritual, where the specific form carries symbolic meaning within a cosmological framework. At Tiwanaku specifically, some researchers have interpreted the cylinders as components of weaving or textile production. The Andean textile tradition being one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, and the tools associated with it being numerous and varied. Others have suggested astronomical or calendrical functions, given Tiwanaku's documented attention to celestial alignment in its major architectural features. None of these interpretations is implausible, none of them has achieved consensus, and none of them fully addresses the question that a small number of researchers, careful, credentialed, and fully aware of the burden of proof they carry, have raised about the manufacturing quality of the most finely worked examples. The surface finish on certain Tiwanaku cylinders has been analyzed using modern measurement tools, and in some cases the results have produced numbers, tolerances, surface roughness values, geometric precision metrics, that sit uncomfortably alongside what is known about pre-Columbian stoneworking technology. Not impossibly so. Not in a way that requires the abandonment of rational explanation, but in a way that opens a genuine question about the full range of techniques available to Tiwanaku craftspeople that the surviving material record has not yet fully revealed. This is not a fringe position dressed in academic language. It is a straightforward acknowledgement of an evidential gap. We know what Tiwanaku produced. We have a partial and incomplete understanding of how they produced it. When the gap between what was made and what we can explain becomes visible in the material itself, the honest response is not to fill it with convenient assumptions, but to hold it open as a space where further investigation is needed. There is also the question of context, of where the cylinders were found, in what associations, alongside what other objects. The excavation history of Tiwanaku is, in parts, poorly documented, with 19th and early 20th century investigations conducted at a standard that would not meet modern archaeological requirements. Objects were removed without full contextual recording, Associations that might have illuminated function and meaning were not captured. What we have, in many cases, is the object in isolation, stripped of the stratigraphic and associative information that would allow it to speak most fully. An object without context is a question without a sentence to belong to. It means something. It was made by someone who knew what it was for. But the surrounding structure of meaning, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter in which this particular object played its particular role, has been lost to the particular carelessness with which the early history of Andean archaeology was sometimes conducted. Tiwanaku was abandoned around 1000 AD, likely in connection with a prolonged drought that undermined the agricultural systems that had sustained it. The great stonework remains on the plateau, exposed to the Andean sky, slowly yielding its secrets to patient investigation. The cylinders sit in storage facilities and museum drawers, their surfaces still smooth, their purpose still unresolved. What were they made for, with that degree of care and precision? And what does it mean that we built the tools to measure their perfection before we built the understanding to explain it? There is a kind of precision that outlasts its own explanation. The Tiwanaku cylinders were made to a standard that the tools we attribute to their makers struggle to account for. Smooth surfaces and exact geometries produced by a civilization whose full technical range we have not yet recovered. The object endures, the knowledge behind it does not. And so we are left holding something perfect and inexplicable, measuring its tolerances with instruments the makers never knew, finding in the gap between what was made and what we can explain a silence that is not emptiness, but depth. But there is another kind of object that the ancient world has left us, one whose mystery is not in its manufacture, but in its expression, not in how it was made, but in what it shows. And what it shows is something so raw, so immediate, so fundamentally human that no amount of scholarly distance fully insulates you from its impact when you first encounter it. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, among the thousands of objects that crowd its galleries in a density that can overwhelm even the most prepared visitor, there is a mummy that stops people. Not because of its wrappings or its cartonnage or the inscription on its case, because of its face. The mouth is open, wide open, jaw dropped in a configuration that, on a living face, would indicate one thing above almost all others. Not sleep, not peace, not the dignified repose that ancient Egyptian funerary practice worked so deliberately to project. What the face of this mummy communicates, across 3,000 years of time and the full thickness of the embalming process, is the appearance of a scream. She is known informally but persistently as the Screaming Woman. Her formal designation in the museum's records is less evocative. Unknown Woman A, recovered from the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, a concealed tomb complex discovered in 1881 that contained the mummies of some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, moved there in antiquity by priests who sought to protect them from tomb robbers. The company she was found in was extraordinary. Rameses II, Seti Thas, Thutmose III. Among the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history, their carefully prepared bodies lying in the same concealed space as this woman whose name has not survived, whose face has not been allowed to rest. The immediate physical explanation for the open mouth is straightforward, and it is the position held by most Egyptologists. In the process of mummification, the jaw must be manually secured, tied or held in place, during the drying process, because the natural relaxation of postmortem musculature causes the mouth to fall open. If the jaw was not properly bound, or if the binding failed or was removed before the tissues hardened fully, the result is a mummy with a permanently open mouth. This is not unknown in the Egyptian record. Several mummies show similar features, and the physical cause is not in itself a mystery. What makes Unknown Woman different? What has kept her name circulating in archaeological and popular literature for over a century is the combination of circumstances that surround her. Not just the open mouth, but the totality of the impression she makes. The neck muscles, preserved by the desiccation process, appear contracted in a way that accentuates the expression. The brow, if you look closely at photographs or stand before her in the museum, carries what seems, to the human eye, with all its pattern recognition instincts, to be the trace of distress. And she was found, uninscribed and unidentified, among royalty, placed in the Deir el-Bahari cache without the labeling that most of the other mummies in that deposit received. Why was she there? Who authorized her inclusion among the bodies of pharaohs? And why, uniquely among the mummies in that extraordinary company, does she appear to wear on her preserved face something that looks, to every person who has ever seen her, like anguish? The theories that have accumulated around her are numerous, and they range from the carefully evidenced to the frankly speculative. One persistent suggestion is that she was buried alive, that the open mouth and the apparent tension in the preserved muscles represent the final physical expression of a woman who died in the process of being mummified or was sealed into her wrappings before death had fully occurred. This theory has been raised in various forms over the decades and has attracted both serious researchers and sensationalist treatment in equal measure. The physical evidence does not support it conclusively, and most Egyptologists regard it as unlikely given what is known of Egyptian mummification practice. A more recent and more carefully evidenced proposal emerged from a 2021 study conducted by a team including Egyptian researcher Sahar Salim, who used CT scanning and other modern analytical tools to examine unknown woman A in detail. The study concluded that the open mouth was likely the result of mummification failure. The jaw had not been properly secured, and proposed a possible identification for the woman based on physical characteristics and the context of her discovery. The candidate suggested was Nebuchadnezzar Mentuhotep II's secondary wife, or possibly a woman of high status from the New Kingdom period. But the proposed identification remains contested, and the question of why an unlabeled, unidentified woman, regardless of her specific identity, was placed in the most exclusive royal cache in Egyptian history remains without a fully satisfying answer. There are researchers who have looked at the Deir el-Bahari cache as a whole, at the decisions made by the priests who assembled it, the judgments about which bodies deserved protection and which did not, and who have argued that unknown woman A's presence there was not accidental or incidental, that someone at some point in the late New Kingdom or early Third Intermediate period made a deliberate choice to include her among the royal dead. That choice implies a status, a significance, a reason, all of which have been erased from the record as completely as her name. Was she a queen whose inscriptions were deliberately removed? A victim of the damnatio memoriae, the Egyptian practice of erasing an individual from the historical record as a form of posthumous punishment? Was she someone whose identity was concealed not by neglect, but by intention, hidden in plain sight among the greatest rulers of her civilization, preserved but unnamed? The Cairo Museum is crowded, and its galleries move at the pace of wonder and fatigue. Most visitors pass her quickly, but those who stop, who look at that face, that open mouth, that expression preserved by the accident of imperfect embalming, tend to find that the image stays with them. She is trying to tell us something, or she appears to be. And after 3,000 years, the distinction between those two possibilities has not been resolved. What happened to her in the hours before she became what she now is? And who decided that whatever she was, she deserved to rest among kings? She rests in her museum case with her mouth open and her name unwritten, placed among kings by a decision that history did not record and has not explained. Whatever she was, queen, priestess, victim, or something that does not fit neatly into any of those categories, she was considered worthy of preservation, worthy of protection, worthy of inclusion in the most carefully guarded collection of royal dead in the ancient world. Someone knew who she was. Someone made a choice. And then that knowledge was lost, or suppressed, or simply outlasted the civilization that held it. The ancient world is full of these absences, not just of names, but of entire frameworks of understanding. The context that would make the strange things legible, the records that would turn the anonymous face into a biography, the documents that would explain why a city was built where it was built, and why, and by whom, and what they believed they were doing when they carved their entire world out of solid rock. because some of the most extraordinary places the ancient world produced were not built at all, in the conventional sense. They were subtracted, removed from the existing substance of the earth, chamber by chamber, corridor by corridor, room by room, by people who looked at a cliff face or a plateau of sandstone and saw, in the solid rock, not an obstacle, but a blueprint. In the country of Georgia, in the South Caucasus, that ancient crossroads where the civilizational currents of the Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe have collided and mingled for millennia, there is a cliff above the Mekvari River, roughly 80 kilometers west of the modern capital Tbilisi, that contains a city. Not the ruins of a city built against a cliff. Not a settlement that used the rock face as one of its walls. A city carved into the interior of the rock itself. Hundreds of rooms, chambers, corridors, and spaces of varying function, cut directly into the sandstone, connected by staircases and passages, organized across multiple levels with an urban logic that is immediately recognizable even to an eye accustomed to conventional architecture. Uplistiki. The name translates roughly as the Fortress of the Lord, though which lord and in which tradition the name originally referred to has shifted across the centuries of the city's extraordinarily long occupation. Because Uplistiki was not built and then abandoned. It was inhabited continuously or near continuously from approximately the 6th century BC until the 13th century AD, a span of nearly 2,000 years during which it passed through pagan, Zoroastrian, and Christian phases of religious and cultural identity, each leaving its traces in the rock alongside the ones that came before. The earliest phases of the city's construction are the ones that introduce the deepest questions. The rock-cut rooms of Uplistiki's oldest sections show architectural features that are, in their specific form and execution, unlike anything that survives from the surrounding region in the same period. Carved ceilings that mimic the wooden beam construction of surface buildings. An extraordinary detail, suggesting that the people who carved these rooms were translating an existing architectural tradition into a new medium, reproducing in stone the visual language of structures they already knew how to build above ground. Why? What drove the decision to move underground, to invest the enormous labor required to cut living space from solid rock when the same labor could have built surface structures more quickly and more easily? The conventional answer points to defense. Uplistiki's position, high above the river, cut into a cliff face, accessible only through controlled approaches, made it a naturally defensible location in a region that was, throughout its history, subject to the kind of political instability and military pressure that makes defensive advantage a primary consideration in urban planning. The rock itself was the fortification. To attack Uplistiki was to attack a mountain. This explanation is sound, and for much of the city's occupation, it clearly applies. The later phases of the city's history, particularly during the medieval Georgian period when it served as a royal refuge and military stronghold, fit the defensive model precisely. But the earliest phase, the original decision, made sometime in the early 1st millennium BC, to begin carving rooms into this particular cliff above this particular river, is harder to account for purely through military logic. The scale of the initial investment and the specific character of the spaces created suggest something more complex than a straightforward fortress. The oldest rooms at Uplistiki include spaces that researchers have interpreted as temples or ritual areas, large, carefully finished chambers with architectural features that carry clear sacred significance within the religious frameworks of the period. There is a large hall with a ceiling of unusual height and a spatial organization that speaks of ceremony rather than habitation. There are smaller rooms whose configuration suggests the performance of ritual rather than the accommodation of daily life. Uplistiki, in its earliest phase, may have been primarily a sacred site, a place chosen not just for its defensibility, but for its spiritual significance within the religious landscape of early Iron Age Georgia. The cliff above the river, the specific quality of the rock, the relationship between the carved interior and the flowing water below. These may have been understood as constituting a place where the boundary between the human and the sacred was perceived to be thinner than elsewhere. This kind of site selection, the choice of a specific natural feature as a focal point for sacred activity, and the subsequent elaboration of that feature through human construction, is a pattern that appears across the ancient world with remarkable consistency. It does not require a single cultural tradition to explain. It appears to reflect something more fundamental about how certain people, in certain periods, understood the relationship between landscape and the sacred. What is less understood is the specific tradition within which the founders of Uplistiki were working. The early religious identity of the site is complex and not fully resolved. Elements that researchers have associated with sun worship, with fertility cult, and with traditions that may connect to the broader religious landscape of the ancient Near East have all been identified in the archaeological material. The city absorbed, over its long life, successive layers of religious identity without fully erasing the ones beneath. A palimpsest of belief written in stone across 2,000 years. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century AD effectively ended Uplistika's active occupation. The city that had survived the rise and fall of multiple empires, the transition from paganism to Christianity, and 2 millennia of Caucasian political turbulence was finally emptied. Its population retreating to Tbilisi, leaving the rock-cut rooms to the wind and the slow patience of erosion. It stands open to the sky now. The carved rooms are visible from the road below, their dark openings in the cliff face suggesting depth and interiority in a landscape that is otherwise open and bright. Tourists walk through it with the particular mix of wonder and insufficient context that most ancient sites produce in the unprepared visitor. The oldest rooms, the ones that predate the defensive walls, the Christian church, the medieval modifications, are still there. Their carved ceilings still mimicking the wooden beams of a surface architecture that has long since rotted away. What did the first people who carved those rooms believe they were entering? And is the answer somewhere in the rock that has not yet been properly asked? Uplistiki was carved into the mountain over centuries, layer by layer, belief by belief, each generation adding its own rooms and rituals to a place that had been sacred before any of them were born. It outlasted empires and invasions, and the transition between entire cosmological systems, pagan to Christian, polytheist to monotheist, absorbing each new identity into its rock without fully surrendering the ones beneath. What ended it was not gradual erosion, but sudden displacement, a Mongol advance that emptied the cliff in a single historical moment and left the carved rooms to the particular stillness that follows human departure. But displacement and fire are different endings. Displacement leaves things intact. Fire changes the fundamental nature of what it touches, transforms stone, vitrifies surfaces, leaves in the archaeological record a signature that is unmistakable and, in the right circumstances, deeply puzzling. Because fire is not always an accident, and fire is not always the work of an enemy. Sometimes the evidence suggests the people who lit the fire were the same people who built what burned. In the far north of Scotland, in the wind-scraped landscapes of Caithness, Sutherland, and the Northern Isles, there are towers. Or rather, there are the remains of towers. Circular, dry stone structures of extraordinary technical sophistication. Their walls built with a double-skin construction that enclosed an internal gallery space and rose, at their height, to perhaps 13 or 15 meters. They are called brocks. There are approximately 500 known examples scattered across the northern and western fringes of Scotland, with the highest concentrations in the areas most exposed to the North Atlantic, the places where the land runs out and the sea begins, the edges of the habitable world as it was understood in the centuries around the turn of the first millennium AD. The Brock is, by any technical measure, a remarkable achievement. Its walls were built without mortar, each stone placed with a precision that allowed the structure to carry its own weight through geometry alone, the double skin tied together by horizontal slabs that distributed load and provided structural stability without the need for any binding material. The internal gallery, the hollow space within the wall itself, served multiple functions. It lightened the structure without compromising its strength, provided insulated living or storage space, and contained the staircases that allowed access to the upper levels. To build a broch was to possess a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering that was, for its time and place, genuinely advanced. Who built them is known, in general terms. They were the work of Iron Age communities in the north and west of Scotland, constructed primarily between roughly 200 BC and 200 AD, a period of approximately 4 centuries, during which the broch tradition flourished and then, with a speed that mirrors its appearance, effectively ceased. No brochs were built after the early centuries AD. No culture that came after the broch builders replicated the form. The tradition appeared, reached a remarkable level of technical refinement, and then stopped, as if a decision had been made, collectively, culturally, to build this way no longer. This alone would be interesting. But it is what happened to many of the brochs, not their abandonment, but their destruction, that introduces the mystery that has not been adequately resolved. A significant number of brochs show evidence of having been burned, not damaged by fire, burned comprehensively, with a heat intense enough to vitrify the stone in their walls. Vitrification is a specific and significant process. It requires temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius sustained over a sufficient period to actually melt the surface of the stone and fuse it into a glass-like material. This is not the kind of heat generated by an accidental domestic fire, or even by a moderately sized deliberate one. It is the heat of a conflagration, a fire that was large, sustained, and of a scale that implies either a catastrophic accident or a deliberate act carried out with considerable commitment. The external threat explanation, that the brochs were burned by raiders or enemies, the fire set from outside as an act of conquest or destruction, is the first interpretation that comes to mind, and for some sites, it may be entirely correct. The period in which the brochs were occupied was not a peaceful one in northern Scotland. Roman military activity in the south of Britain created pressure that rippled northward, and the communities of the far north were not immune to the kind of intergroup conflict that characterizes societies under external stress. But the pattern of burning at certain broch sites does not cooperate cleanly with the external attack model. At some locations, the evidence suggests that the fire was set not from outside, but from within, that the burning originated inside the structure, in ways that are more consistent with a deliberate interior fire than with an external assault. At others, the specific distribution of vitrified stone indicates that the burning was methodical rather than chaotic, concentrated in ways that suggest the fire was managed, or at least initiated with intention, rather than spreading as a random conflagration would. This has led a number of researchers to consider a possibility that, once raised, is difficult to set aside entirely, that at least some of the burned brochs were deliberately destroyed by their own inhabitants, that the fire was not an ending imposed from outside, but a closing act performed by the people who had lived within the walls, a controlled demolition, a ritual termination, a deliberate transformation of a structure that had served its purpose into something that could no longer be occupied or replicated. The practice of deliberate structure destruction, the purposeful ending of a building's life as a meaningful act rather than a practical one, is documented in the archaeological record of the ancient world with enough frequency to be taken seriously as a category of human behavior. Across many cultures, buildings were not simply abandoned when they were no longer needed. They were closed, decommissioned through specific acts that transform their status from active to inactive, from inhabited to finished. The act of burning, in this framework, was not destruction, but completion. If this is what happened at certain brochs, it raises questions that the stone cannot answer. What circumstances, social, political, spiritual, would lead a community to burn its own tower? What had the broch meant to them, and what did it mean for that meaning to be permanently ended? Was the cessation of broch building across northern Scotland not a cultural collapse, but a cultural decision, a collective choice to close a chapter that had run its course? The towers that remain stand in the northern light with their vitrified walls, their stones fused by a heat that has not been fully explained. Some of them are astonishingly well preserved. Mousa Broch, on the Shetland island of the same name, still stands to its original height, its walls as tight and precise as the day they were laid. It did not burn. It simply endures, the exception that makes the burned ones more, not less, mysterious. Who lit those fires? And what did they believe they were releasing when the towers finally fell? Fire closes things. The burned Brocks of Scotland are endings. Deliberate or otherwise, their vitrified walls mark a terminal point, a moment after which something that had existed ceased to exist in the form it had taken. Whether the fire was set by enemies or by the inhabitants themselves, whether it was destruction or completion, the result is the same. A structure that was whole became something irrecoverable, and whatever knowledge and practice it housed went with it. But there is another kind of unfinished story in the ancient world, one that is not about endings, but about interruptions. Not the deliberate termination of something completed, but the sudden arrest of something in progress. The project abandoned mid-execution, the tool set down and never retrieved. The ambition frozen at the moment of its greatest expression, preserved not in its finished form but in the act of becoming, caught between intention and completion, between the idea and the object the idea was reaching toward. In the city of Aswan, in the far south of Egypt, where the Nile narrows between granite outcroppings and the desert presses close on both sides, there is a quarry. Not a ruin of a quarry, an ancient site that requires imaginative reconstruction to understand. The quarry at Aswan is immediately, viscerally legible. The tool marks are still in the rock. The ramps and channels cut to extract the stone are still clearly defined. The granite still bears the color variations that ancient workers used to read the quality of the material they were cutting. And lying in the floor of the quarry, still attached to the bedrock from which it was never fully separated, is an object of staggering scale. The unfinished obelisk of Aswan. At approximately 42 meters in length and an estimated weight, had it been completed, of nearly 1,200 tons, it would have been the largest obelisk ever cut in ancient Egypt. Larger than any that was successfully raised, larger than any that stands today in Cairo or Rome or New York or London or any of the other cities to which the monuments of Egyptian power were eventually dispersed. It would have been, by a significant margin, the most ambitious single stone object the ancient world had ever attempted to produce. It was never finished. Cracks appeared in the granite during the cutting process, fractures running through the stone in ways that would have compromised the structural integrity of the finished monument. The workers stopped. The tools were set aside. The obelisk was left where it lay, still connected to the earth it had been intended to rise above, and the quarry eventually fell silent around it. This much is established. This much is not in dispute. What is in dispute? What remains, beneath the apparently simple surface of an abandoned construction project, a genuinely complex and unresolved set of questions, is almost everything else. The obelisk is conventionally attributed to the reign of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ruled Egypt in the first half of the 15th century BC, and who was responsible for some of the most ambitious construction projects of the New Kingdom, including the pair of obelisks she raised at Karnak that were, at the time, the tallest in Egypt. The attribution to Hatshepsut is reasonable, but not conclusively proven. The obelisk itself bears no inscription, and the dating is based primarily on stylistic and contextual evidence rather than direct textual documentation. The more interesting questions are not about who ordered it, but about how it was meant to be made. An obelisk of this scale, 42 meters, 1,200 tons, presents engineering challenges that go considerably beyond those of the smaller monuments that were successfully completed and raised. The logistics of cutting a single piece of granite of this mass from bedrock, moving it from the quarry to the Nile, transporting it by water to its destination, and raising it vertically to a standing position, are challenges that Egyptologists have debated, modeled, and experimented with for decades without arriving at a fully satisfying consensus. The tool marks visible on the surface of the unfinished obelisk are one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in this debate. They show in preserved detail the method used to separate the obelisk from the surrounding rock, a process that involved pounding the granite with balls of an even harder stone, dolerite, to create trenches on all sides and beneath the monument. The dolerite pounders have been found at the site, some still lying where they were set down when the work stopped. It is painstaking, labor-intensive work, the kind that requires not just physical effort, but organizational capacity, the coordination of large numbers of workers over an extended period, and a management system sophisticated enough to maintain that coordination consistently. What the tool marks do not show is any evidence of the kind of metal-cutting tools, saws, drills, that certain researchers have argued would have been necessary to achieve some of the precision visible in completed Egyptian stonework of the same period. This absence is significant, and it has been interpreted in different ways by different researchers. Some argue that the pounding technique alone was sufficient, that Egyptian stoneworkers achieved remarkable results through patience, skill, and the systematic application of a simple technology. Others point to the absence of evidence as precisely that, an absence, not a proof, and suggest that other techniques may have been used that left different or less visible signatures in the stone. A small number of researchers, working at the more speculative end of the field but not without technical grounding, have examined the Aswan quarry in the context of broader questions about Egyptian precision stonework and have raised the possibility that the full range of techniques available to Egyptian craftspeople has not been recovered from the archaeological record, that the pounders and the ramps and the sledges represent the visible, durable portion of a technological toolkit that may have included methods that left less obvious traces. What those methods might have been is a question that generates considerable heat in certain corners of archaeological discourse and considerably less light. There is also a question that the obelisk raises simply by being the size it is. Egypt successfully quarried, transported, and raised obelisks of impressive scale throughout the New Kingdom. The technology existed demonstrably to accomplish remarkable things with granite. But the Aswan obelisk was not a modest extension of established capability. It was a leap, an attempt to do something significantly larger than anything previously achieved, and it failed at the first stage, before the stone left the ground. Was this an act of ambition that outreached the available technology? Or was it an attempt to apply a technology that was already understood, interrupted not by the limits of capability, but by the accident of a crack in the wrong place at the wrong time? The obelisk lies where it always has, in the granite of Aswan, half-born, attached to the earth it never rose above. Around it, the marks of 10,000 hands are still visible in the rock, the evidence of an intention so large it could not be completed, and so durable it could not be erased. What would it have looked like, standing? And is there something in the scale of the attempt, in the ambition of imagining a single stone of 1,200 tons rising above the Nile, that tells us something about the Egyptian understanding of what was possible that we have not yet fully absorbed? Egypt's ambitions were written in granite, in the scale of what was attempted, in the precision of what was achieved, and in the rare, instructive failure of what was not. The unfinished obelisk lies in its quarry as a monument to the outer edge of capability, the point where intention met the resistance of the material world and stopped. It is a useful reminder that even the most technically sophisticated ancient civilizations operated within limits, that the gap between what they imagined and what they could execute was real, even if we have not always located it correctly. But there is another category of ancient object that presents the opposite problem. Not the monument too large to complete, but the artifact too small to ignore. Not the ambition that outreached its technology, but the object that appears to exceed the technology available to the people who, by any conventional account, should have made it. And unlike the Tiwanaku cylinders or the precision stonework of Egypt, where the questions, however unresolved, exist within a framework of established civilizational context, there are objects that surface without any context at all, without a culture to assign them to, without a tradition to place them within, objects that appear, fully formed and deeply anomalous, in a landscape that has no obvious explanation for their existence. In the spring of 1872, in the town of Meredith, New Hampshire, workers digging a fence post on the shore of Lake Winnipesaukee struck something hard in the clay several feet below the surface. What they pulled from the earth was an egg-shaped stone, approximately 10 centimeters in length and 6 centimeters at its widest point, dark and smooth and clearly worked by human hands. Its discoverer was Seneca Ladd, a local businessman who recognized immediately that what his workers had found was unusual. He cleaned it, he examined it, he kept it, and then he, and everyone who has examined it since, spent considerable time trying to understand what it was, where it came from, and who made it. The Mystery Stone of Lake Winnipesaukee, as it came to be called, and the name has stuck with a persistence that reflects the genuine failure of more authoritative labels to take hold, is an object of considerable visual complexity for its size. Its surface is covered with carved symbols and images, a human face, rendered with a directness that suggests portraiture rather than abstraction, a teepee or wigwam form, an ear of corn, what appears to be a crescent moon, a spiral, various geometric forms whose specific significance has not been agreed upon. On one end of the egg, a perfectly circular hole has been drilled, a hole whose sides are smooth, whose geometry is precise, and whose method of production has been one of the most persistent sources of debate surrounding the object. The hole appears to have been drilled from both ends, meeting in the middle with an accuracy that requires either considerable skill with conventional tools, or, some researchers have suggested, a tool that was not conventional at all. Specifically, the smoothness and precision of the bore has been cited as evidence, contested, but cited, that the hole was made with a mechanical drill of some kind, at a time and in a place where mechanical drills are not supposed to have existed. This claim requires careful handling, and it has not always received it. The history of the Mystery Stone's public presentation includes a significant amount of sensationalist treatment. The object has been connected, at various points, to Vikings, to pre-Columbian European contact, to lost civilizations, and to the full range of alternative history frameworks that objects without clear provenance tend to attract. Most of these connections are not supported by serious evidence, and the responsible approach is to set them aside and focus on what the object actually shows. What it actually shows is genuinely interesting enough without embellishment. The symbols carved on the stone surface do not, as far as any researcher has been able to establish with confidence, correspond to any known indigenous North American symbolic tradition from the region. This is a significant statement, and it needs to be made carefully. The northeastern woodlands of North America were home to sophisticated cultures with rich symbolic traditions, some of which are documented and some of which are not. The absence of a match between the Mystery Stone's imagery and the documented traditions of the region does not mean the object is not Native American in origin. It may simply mean that the specific tradition it belongs to is one that has not been adequately recorded, or that the object dates to a period before the traditions we have documented were in their familiar form. State geologist Charles Hitchcock examined the stone in the 19th century and expressed uncertainty about the tool marks, noting that certain aspects of the carving and drilling did not obviously correspond to the tool technologies he would have expected from the region's pre-contact inhabitants. More recent analysis, including examination at the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, has not produced a definitive conclusion about either the age of the object or the methods used to produce it. The material itself is a dark, fine-grained stone identified as a type of quartzite or myelinite, a metamorphic rock that is harder than most stoneworking traditions work with routinely because of the difficulty of carving it with conventional implements. The symbols are carved with a clarity and depth that required either exceptional skill with stone tools or something that made the work easier than it should have been. Which of those is the correct explanation has not been settled. The provenance of the stone, the circumstances of its discovery, adds another layer of complexity. Seneca Ladd's account of the find was recorded, but not until some years after the discovery, and the details of exactly where it was found, at what depth, and in what stratigraphic context were never fully documented to a standard that would allow the object to be dated by its depositional circumstances. The clay it was found in could, theoretically, date to almost any period. Without reliable contextual dating, and without a symbolic tradition to place it within, the stone floats in a kind of temporal and cultural ambiguity that has resisted resolution for over 150 years. It is held now in the collections of the Museum of New Hampshire History in Concord, where it has been since shortly after its discovery. Small, dark, egg-shaped, covered in symbols that no one has fully decoded, with a hole drilled through it whose method of production remains a subject of quiet but persistent disagreement. Who made it? When? And what were they trying to say? Not just in the symbols on the surface, but in the act of making the object itself, burying it in the clay near a lake in a landscape that has, so far, yielded nothing else quite like it. The lake has kept its silence for a century and a half. The stone has offered its symbols to every expert who has examined it, and kept their meaning for itself. What does it know that we do not?